thick blanket of undisturbed dust covered every surface of the attic, and the stale, suffocating air tasted like something that had been sealed away for far too long. I stood at the top of the narrow service staircase, one hand gripping the cold brass railing, the other pressing a handkerchief against my nose. The fabric filtered very little emotion. The attic smelled overwhelmingly of damp timber, dry rot, and something faintly chemical that I could not immediately identify. Perhaps old lacquer from the steamer trunks my father had stored here decades ago. Thin columns of grey afternoon light sliced through the gaps in the boarded windows, catching suspended particles of dust in slow, drifting constellations. I had not climbed these stairs in at least 15 years. There had never been a reason to. The Pendelton Manor was a sprawling 3-story Victorian structure with more rooms than any single man could ever justify occupying, and the attic had always been the territory of forgotten things, broken furniture, mildewed textiles, and the accumulated debris of 3 generations of a family that never threw anything away. My late wife, Margaret, had always warned me against it. "Nobody goes up there anymore, Arthur," she had said, her voice carrying the confident finality of someone who understood the house better than I ever would. And so, for 30 years, I had listened. But Margaret had been gone for 2 years now. Silence in the manor had changed since her passing. It had shifted from comfortable to oppressive, and that morning, while sorting through a drawer of old utility receipts in the study, I had found a small brass key attached to a faded tag that read, in my father's meticulous cursive, "Attic, floor panel 7. I had rubbed my jaw, staring at the tag for a long time. Emotion. My father had died in 1989. The fact that he had labelled a specific floorboard with a specific key suggested a deliberate intention to conceal something, and an equally deliberate intention to eventually retrieve it. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight as I stepped fully into the attic. Emotion. The sound was low and resonant, as though the old timber was protesting my intrusion. I moved carefully, testing each plank before committing my full 180 pounds. The wood was soft in places, weakened by moisture and age. A sharp, dry crack sent a jolt through my ankles as one board bowed dangerously under my right foot, and I instinctively grabbed the nearest roof beam to steady myself. The rough, splintered surface of the beam scraped harshly against my palm. Panel 7. I began counting from the eastern wall, where the floorboards ran perpendicular to the roof joists. 1, 2, 3. The dust was so thick on the floor that my shoes left clearly defined prints behind me, as if I were walking through fresh snow. 4, 6. I paused at the 7th panel. It looked identical to every other board in the attic, warped, grey, and unremarkable. But when I knelt down and pressed the heel of my hand against its edge, I felt something that the others lacked, a faint, mechanical give. The board was not nailed. I inserted the brass key into a narrow slot concealed beneath the joint between the 7th and 8th panels. It fit perfectly. I turned the key, and a rusted latch mechanism clicked heavily beneath the floor, with a sound that echoed sharply off the low ceiling. The board lifted on a hidden hinge, releasing a sudden rush of cold, stale air from the cavity below, air that carried a distinctly metallic taste, almost like old blood. Beneath the floorboard was a small iron safe, roughly the size of a bread box, embedded directly into the structural beam. It was coated in a thin layer of orange rust, but structurally intact. The safe had no external keyhole. Instead, a 3-dial combination lock was mounted on its face, the tiny white numbers barely visible beneath decades of accumulated grime. I sat back on my heels, resting my calloused hands on my knees. My heartbeat had accelerated without my conscious awareness, and I could feel a low, persistent throbbing at my temples. The discovery did not excite me, it unsettled me. Emotion. My father had been a private man, private in a way that I had always interpreted as reserved rather than secretive. He had run Pendleton Textiles with military precision, and he had raised me with the same discipline. He had never, to my knowledge, hidden anything from the family. Emotion. But this safe told a different story. The deliberate engineering of the concealment, the labelled key, the custom latch, the combination lock, suggested not a casual act of storage but a calculated decision to bury something where it would not be easily found. The cold air rising from the cavity smelled like damp earth, and it carried with it a weight that I could not articulate but could absolutely feel, somewhere deep in my chest, like a pressure that made each breath slightly harder to draw. I rubbed my jaw again, harder this time, feeling the rough stubble beneath my fingertips. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps my father had simply stored old financial documents or outdated property deeds in a fireproof container, as any pragmatic businessman might. Perhaps the elaborate concealment was merely a product of his generation's reflexive distrust of banks. But as I knelt there in the grey, dust-choked light of the attic, staring down at the rusted surface of the safe, I could not shake the feeling that I was looking at something that had been deliberately kept from me. Not forgotten, kept, emotion. The distinction mattered. A forgotten object gathers dust passively. A kept secret acquires weight actively, pressing against the floorboards above it, waiting with a patience that no living thing could match. I closed the panel carefully, pressing the board back into its original position until the latch clicked shut. I pocketed the brass key, stood slowly, and brushed the dust from my knees. My legs felt heavier than they had when I climbed the stairs. The attic was exactly as silent as it had been when I entered, but something fundamental about that silence had changed. It was no longer the empty quiet of a neglected room. It was the dense, watchful quiet of a room that contained something it was not supposed to contain. I descended the staircase without looking back, gripping the cold railing with both hands. The manor settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, but I noticed them now in a way I never had before, as if the house itself was aware that the floorboard had been opened and the secret beneath it had been, for the first time in decades, acknowledged. I walked directly to the study and sat heavily in my father's old leather chair. The chair smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, a ghost of his presence that had somehow survived 35 years of disuse. I placed the brass key on the mahogany desk in front of me. The late afternoon light caught the surface of the metal, and it glowed dully against the dark wood like a small, quiet warning. I would need to open the safe, that much was certain. Whatever my father had hidden beneath the 7th floorboard, it was mine now, his burden transferred, as so many things in this family were transferred, without explanation or consent. The quiet retirement I had carefully constructed over the past 2 years, the morning walks, the afternoon reading, the deliberate and systematic emptying of rooms, suddenly felt fragile. The manor had offered up a secret, and secrets, once discovered, demanded attention. I rubbed my jaw one final time, staring at the key. Tensed, the grey November light was fading rapidly, pulling shadows across the study floor like dark fingers reaching for the desk. The manor creaked softly around me, settling into the cold evening, and for the first time since Margaret's death, the silence in the house felt less like absence and more like something that was deliberately holding its breath. I had hoped for a family heirloom, a pocket watch perhaps, or my mother's missing pearls, but what I found instead was the meticulous architecture of systematic extortion. The safe had resisted me for 2 days. I had tried every combination I could think of: birthdays, anniversaries, the founding year of Pendelton Textiles, before it occurred to me that my father would never have used anything sentimental. He had been a man of systems, not sentiment. On the 3rd morning, sitting at his desk with the brass key turning slowly between my fingers, I tried the 6-digit patent number stamped on the bottom of his favorite fountain pen. The dials clicked into place with a smooth, mechanical precision that felt almost like approval. The iron lid opened heavily on dry hinges, releasing a rush of trapped air that smelled of old paper and something faintly acidic, the chemical signature of ink that had been slowly degassing for decades in sealed darkness. Inside, arranged with the same compulsive neatness my father had applied to every aspect of his professional life, were 7 manila folders. Each was labeled in his tight, angular handwriting. Each was dated, each was thick with documents. I lifted the first folder with both hands. It was heavier than I expected, as though the paper itself had absorbed the weight of what it contained. The label read, Pendleton Textiles, Leverage Archive, 1962 to 1987. I stared at the word leverage for a long time. It was such a careful euphemism. Such a precise, bloodless word for what I was about to discover was anything but bloodless. I opened the folder on the desk, and the contents spread across the mahogany surface like an autopsy. Photocopied bank statements, handwritten letters on corporate letterhead, typed summaries with names, dates, and dollar amounts arranged in neat columns, and photographs, dozens of photographs, taken from distances that suggested surveillance, showing men and women in situations that were clearly private and clearly compromising. The first complete dossier I read belonged to a man named Gerald Hutchins, who had been a city councilman in 1964. My father's notes, attached with a rusted paperclip, documented in clinical detail how Hutchins had been redirecting municipal contracts to a construction firm in exchange for cash payments. The evidence was thorough: cancelled checks, meeting transcripts, even a floor plan of the restaurant where the exchanges took place. And at the bottom of the file, a single typed memo: leverage secured, voting bloc guaranteed through 1968 redistricting. My father had not reported Gerald Hutchins. He had used him. I sat very still in the leather chair, a Mosineux leather chair. The study was completely silent except for the slow mechanical tick of the mantel clock, each sound landing in the room like a small stone dropped into deep water. I could feel something shifting inside my chest. Not a sharp sensation, but a slow, spreading pressure, as if the floor beneath my understanding of my family was gradually giving way. I continued reading. The second folder contained a similar dossier on a textile industry regulator who had been accepting gifts from competing manufacturers. The third documented a banker whose approval had been essential for a critical expansion loan in 1971. The fourth, the fifth. Each file was a portrait of a specific person's vulnerability, photographed from the shadows, catalogued with forensic patience, and then leveraged, that word again, to advance the commercial interests of Pendleton Textiles. The shame arrived gradually, like a tide. It did not crash over me. It rose slowly, filling spaces I had not known were empty. I had spent my entire professional life as the quiet steward of my father's legacy. I had managed the company's trusts, maintained the estate, represented the family name at charitable functions with what I believed was earned dignity. And now, folder by folder, I was learning that the foundation beneath all of it, the wealth, the reputation, the social position, was built on the systematic exploitation of other people's worst moments. I rubbed my jaw hard enough to leave a red mark on my skin. The rough stubble beneath my fingers felt like the only honest texture in the room. The sixth folder was different. It was thinner than the others, and the label bore no name, only a date, March 1987. Inside was a single document, handwritten entirely in my father's script. It was not a dossier, it was a personal account, a narrative, describing what appeared to be a confrontation with someone who had discovered the archive's existence and attempted to expose it. The handwriting was less controlled than the other documents, the letters tighter and more angular, as though written under significant emotional pressure. The narrative ended abruptly, mid-sentence, at the bottom of the third page. The remaining pages had been torn out. I closed the folder and placed both of my hands flat on the desk. They were trembling slightly. The late morning light was streaming through the study windows now, warming the surface of the desk and catching the edges of the scattered documents in a way that made them look almost beautiful. Crisp, archival, clean. But I no longer saw clean paper. I saw leverage, emotion. So I saw the careful, patient machinery of a man who had built his family's entire world on the organized destruction of other people's reputations. My first instinct was immediate and powerful. Bury it. Close the safe. Turn the combination. Replace the floorboard. Seal the attic. Pretend the brass key did not exist. Let the dust reclaim what the dust had hidden for decades. Nobody knew, nobody needed to know. I stood up from the desk and walked to the window. The garden was overgrown, the hedgerows wild, the stone paths cracked and invaded by weeds. The manor was deteriorating around me, slowly and inevitably, and now I understood that the decay was not just physical, it ran through the foundations. It had always been there, beneath the surface, hidden under polished floors and family portraits and the respectable hum of a textile empire that had seemed from every visible angle to be built on nothing more controversial than hard work and good luck. I pressed my forehead against the cold window glass. The sensation was sharp and grounding. Outside, a single crow landed on the stone wall at the edge of the property, turned its black head, and regarded the house with an expression I could only describe as patient. I needed to think. But thinking required a clarity that I did not currently possess. Every memory of my father, the firm handshakes, the measured advice, the quiet pride he had displayed when I graduated, the solemn speech he had given at my mother's funeral, was now contaminated by the contents of those 7 folders. The man I had admired was a stranger. The legacy I had protected was a lie. I returned to the desk and carefully placed each folder back into the safe in the exact order I had found them. I closed the iron lid, spun the combination lock until the dials scrambled, and sat down in the chair. The brass key sat on the desk where I had left it, glowing dully in the sunlight. I did not go up to the attic to replace the floorboard. I was not yet ready to decide what the discovery meant, but I was already certain of one thing. The quiet retirement I had been living was over. The manor had given up its secret, and now that secret belonged to me, along with every terrible decision it would inevitably demand. Emotion. I had been expecting a phone call, perhaps, or a letter, not Julian Vance himself, standing on my doorstep with a bottle of single malt scotch and a smile that seemed to know more than it should. The doorbell had rung at precisely 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. I had been sitting in the study, staring at the closed safe in the attic through the ceiling as though I could see through plaster and timber, when the sharp metallic chime cut through the silence and sent a cold jolt through my chest. The study smelled heavily of old paper and stale coffee, remnants of a sleepless night spent reading my father's damning files. I had not been expecting visitors. I had not invited anyone. The manor was a 20-minute drive from the nearest town, and people did not simply appear at the Pendelton estate without purpose. I closed the study door behind me and turned the brass lock before walking to the front entrance. The blackmail folders were still spread across the desk. The thought of anyone seeing those documents produced a physical tightness across my sternum that made it difficult to breathe. The taste of the morning's bitter, overbrewed coffee still coated the back of my tongue. Julian Vance stood on the stone portico in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His silver hair was immaculate, swept back from a tanned forehead that belonged to a man who spent his winters somewhere warmer than this part of the country. He held the bottle of scotch in one hand and extended the other toward me with the practiced ease of someone who had been performing friendly gestures for so long that the mechanics had become indistinguishable from sincerity. "Arthur, old friend," he said. His voice was smooth, modulated, pitched at that precise register that made everything he said sound simultaneously casual and important. "You look like you haven't slept in days. I was in the area, thought I'd check in." I shook his hand. His grip was firm and warm, the skin dry and well-maintained. I noticed he held the handshake a fraction longer than was natural, and his pale blue eyes, those ice-sharp eyes that had always unsettled me, even when we were younger, moved past my shoulder into the dim hallway behind me before returning to my face. A cold November wind followed him through the front door, carrying the distinct smell of expensive cologne and damp leather into the stale warmth of the foyer. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice at the same measured tempo I had used my entire life. "This is unexpected. Come in." I led him through the foyer and into the sitting room rather than the study. The choice was deliberate and immediate. The sitting room was neutral territory, bare walls, a cold fireplace, furniture covered in dust cloths that smelled faintly of mothballs and mildew. Nothing in it could betray me. Julian surveyed the room with an expression I could only interpret as mild amusement, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly as he took in the visible decay. "The old place is showing its age," he observed, settling into an armchair and unbuttoning his overcoat. His movements were fluid, controlled, the kind of physical economy that came from a lifetime of boardrooms where every gesture was calculated. He placed the scotch bottle on the side table and began toying with his left cufflink, a heavy platinum piece that caught the grey light from the window. Margaret would have been horrified. The mention of my wife's name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I ignored it. "What brings you out here, Julian? You haven't visited in years." "Nostalgia, mostly." He crossed one leg over the other and leaned back. His posture appeared relaxed, but something about the angle of his shoulders, a slight forward tension, barely perceptible, told me the relaxation was constructed rather than genuine. "I've been thinking about your father lately, about the old days. You know, clearing out the archives at the Vance Foundation, I came across some correspondence between our families from the 70s, business letters, mostly. Made me wonder if you'd come across anything similar while managing the estate." The shift was so smooth that I almost missed it. Almost. The conversation had traveled from scotch to nostalgia to family correspondence in under 2 minutes. And now Julian Vance was sitting in my deteriorating sitting room, toying with his cufflinks, and casually asking me whether I had found any old papers. I rubbed my jaw. The coarse stubble scratched against my fingertips. The gesture bought me 3 seconds of silence. Papers? I repeated, allowing my voice to carry nothing but polite confusion. Old documents, records, that sort of thing. Julian waved one hand in a gesture of casual dismissal, but his eyes did not match the gesture. They remained fixed on my face with an intensity that felt almost surgical, the pale blue irises catching the cold daylight like polished glass. Your father was meticulous. I imagine the attic is full of old files. The word attic arrived in the conversation like a detonation heard through deep water. I felt my pulse accelerate, a sharp uptick that I was certain showed nowhere on my face but thundered loudly enough in my own ears to fill the room. Julian could not possibly know about the safe. The floorboard had been undisturbed for decades. The dust had been pristine, and yet he had used the word attic. Not study, not office, not storage, but attic. The precision of it was something I could practically taste, sour and metallic, spreading across the roof of my mouth. Emotion. The attic is mostly broken furniture and old clothes, I said carefully. Nothing of interest. Julian smiled. It was a specific kind of smile, the kind where the mouth performed one thing and the eyes performed another. His lips curved upward with convincing warmth, but his pale blue irises carried something colder, something that I was beginning to recognize as not curiosity but surveillance. Of course, he said lightly, I'm sure your father wasn't the type to leave anything important lying around. We spoke for another 40 minutes. Julian accepted a cup of tea which I prepared in the kitchen specifically to buy myself time away from his gaze. The kitchen smelled of damp stone and old cooking grease, a heavy earthen scent that felt honest compared to the performative cologne lingering in the sitting room. He discussed the real estate market, a charity gala his foundation was sponsoring, and a renovation project at his penthouse, topics that were aggressively ordinary. But every few minutes the conversation would circle back, gently and persistently, to the manor. Had I considered selling it? Was I managing the upkeep alone? Had the family solicitor been by recently to review the estate documents? Each question was dressed in concern. Each question was a probe. I walked him to the front door at noon. The November air was sharp and cold, immediately biting the exposed skin of my face and hands. The smell of wet leaves and approaching rain filled the gravel drive. Julian shrugged his overcoat tighter and turned to face me on the portico, his hand extended once more. Take care of yourself, Arthur, he said, and something in the cadence of his smooth voice, a slight downward inflection on the word yourself, made it sound less like advice and more like a warning. He held my gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, then turned and walked to his black sedan, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the wet flagstones. I stood in the doorway until the car disappeared around the bend in the drive. The cold air smelled clean and empty compared to the suffocating tension that had filled the sitting room. Then I locked the front door, walked directly to the study, and unlocked the brass handle with hands that were no longer steady. The folders were exactly where I had left them. The safe key was in my pocket, pressing against my thigh like a cold accusation. Julian Vance had not visited out of nostalgia. Julian Vance had come to determine exactly how much I knew. Emotion you desnings of miste. And from the careful architecture of his questions, the surgical probing, the predatory patience, the word attic deployed like a precision instrument, I was now certain of something that turned my anxiety into something far sharper and far more dangerous. Julian Vance already knew about the safe. The only question was how long he had known and what he intended to do about it. Emotion. I had always been honest with Eleanor, painfully, sometimes stubbornly honest, which made what I was about to do feel less like protection and more like betrayal. The study was dim. I had pulled the heavy curtains shut before picking up the phone, a gesture that served no practical purpose but felt instinctively necessary, as though the darkness could contain what I was about to say. The room smelled of cold fireplace ash and the faint, persistent scent of my father's pipe tobacco that still clung to the leather chair after 35 years. I rubbed my jaw, feeling the rough stubble scratch against my palm, and stared at the phone in my other hand. Eleanor's name glowed on the screen, a bright, clean rectangle of light in the otherwise grey room. I pressed the call button. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. "Dad!" Her voice arrived with the sharp, efficient energy that had always defined her. Even through the phone's tinny speaker, I could hear the clatter of activity behind her. Keyboards, muffled voices, the ambient hum of a busy political office. Eleanor was in the middle of her campaign for state attorney general, and I knew from experience that every minute of her day was accounted for. "I've been meaning to call you. How's the manor? Are you eating properly?" "The manor is fine," I said, and the lie landed in my mouth like a dry stone. I could taste it, flat and bitter, sitting on the back of my tongue as I spoke. "Quiet, as always. I've been clearing out some of the upstairs rooms. Nothing exciting. You're not up in that attic again, are you?" Her tone shifted, still warm, but carrying the undercurrent of concern that she had inherited from her mother. "Mum always said that place was a death trap. Rotting floorboards, no insulation, probably asbestos in the ceiling tiles. I've been staying out of the attic," I said. The second lie, it came easier than the first, which troubled me more than the lie itself. "Just the bedrooms, sorting through old linens, boxing up things for donation." "Good." I could hear her relax slightly, a subtle softening in the cadence of her breathing that I had learned to recognize over 32 years of listening to my daughter speak. "Listen, I was thinking about coming up for Thanksgiving. The campaign is brutal, but I can take 3 days. We could have dinner in the dining room, like we used to. I'll bring wine." The offer landed in my chest like a physical blow. The idea of Eleanor in this house, walking these hallways, sitting in this study, sleeping in her old bedroom directly beneath the attic, where her grandfather's blackmail archive sat hidden behind a rusted iron lock, produced a visceral, almost nauseous reaction that I had to actively suppress. I gripped the armrest of the leather chair and felt the worn, cracked surface press into my fingers. "Thanksgiving might not be great this year, sweetheart," I said. My voice was steady, measured. The same deliberate tempo I had used my entire life, now weaponized against my own daughter. "I'm having some work done on the plumbing. The downstairs bathroom is out of commission. It's a mess. The contractors have torn up half the ground floor." The third lie. Each one was building on the last, constructing a false architecture that I would eventually need to maintain, expand, or demolish. But in this moment, the only thing that mattered was keeping Eleanor away from the manor, away from the safe, away from the truth about the Pendelton name that she was currently campaigning under, a name that, as of 3 days ago, I knew was built on systematic extortion and the deliberate destruction of other people's lives. Oh, her disappointment was audible, a brief drop in pitch that she quickly corrected with her characteristic resilience. "Okay, Christmas then." "Christmas," I agreed, knowing full well that I might need to manufacture another excuse when the time came. That would be better. The work should be done by then. Eleanor launched into a rapid summary of her campaign, a debate she had won, a fundraiser that had exceeded targets, a newspaper endorsement that she described with barely contained pride. I listened, making the appropriate sounds of encouragement at the appropriate moments, but my mind was elsewhere. It was in the attic. It was in the safe. It was on the 7th floorboard from the eastern wall, where my father's meticulous records documented 25 years of leveraging other people's vulnerabilities for commercial advantage. Eleanor did not know, she could not know, if the contents of those folders ever surfaced, if Julian Vance or anyone else who might be aware of their existence chose to make them public. Eleanor's campaign would collapse overnight, her career, hence her reputation. The Pendleton name that she wore with such fierce, unexamined pride would become a synonym for corruption, and she would look at me, her father, and she would know that I had known and said nothing. The guilt was not sharp, it was heavy. It settled across my shoulders like a wet overcoat, adding weight to every breath, pressing down on my chest until my lungs had to work harder to pull in the stale, tobacco-scented air of the study. I was not protecting Eleanor by lying. I was protecting myself, protecting my ability to look her in the eye without flinching, to hear her say "Dad" without the word carrying the full devastating weight of what I had discovered. "Dad, you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "Sorry, bad connection. You sound distracted. Are you sure everything's okay?" "Everything's fine, Eleanor." The fourth lie, the easiest one yet, and that ease, the smooth, practiced facility with which the words left my mouth, was the most frightening thing I had experienced since opening the safe, because it meant I was getting better at it, and getting better at lying to my daughter was not a skill I had ever wanted to acquire. We said our goodbyes. Eleanor promised to call on Sunday. I promised to eat something other than toast. The phone went dark, and I placed it face down on the desk, next to the brass key that still sat where I had left it 3 days ago. The key caught no light in the dim study. It simply sat there, small and cold and patient, waiting for me to decide what to do next. I did not move from the chair for a long time. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks, the old timber contracting in the cold, the pipes ticking somewhere in the walls, the distant sound of wind pressing against the boarded attic windows. Every sound was a reminder that the manor was full of things that were hidden, and that I had just added one more. The truth, sealed away from my own daughter behind a wall of careful, measured lies that I was building brick by brick, each one heavier than the last. The smell of pipe tobacco seemed stronger now, as if my father's ghost approved. Emotion. I traced my index finger down the column of redacted bank transfers, my fingernail catching on the rough texture of the aged paper until I stopped at a familiar signature. Midnight had come and gone. The manor was wrapped in a suffocating silence, save for the rhythmic, heavy pelting of November rain against the tall study windows. I sat at my father's heavy mahogany desk, the brass key to the safe resting near the base of the dim desk lamp. The circle of yellow light illuminated the scattered contents of the fourth blackmail folder. The study smelled aggressively of old, decaying paper mixed with the stale, lingering ghost of pipe tobacco from decades past. I raised a porcelain cup to my lips and took a sip. The coffee had grown completely cold hours ago, leaving a sharp, overly bitter taste that coated the back of my tongue. It felt appropriate. Everything about tonight was bitter. Since Julian Vance's unexpected visit, a deep, pervasive anxiety had settled into my bones, a hollow ache that made my hands tremble whenever I stopped moving. My lies to Eleanor had bought me time, but time was merely a vehicle for understanding the sheer scale of the danger surrounding me. The crushing weight of having crossed the line into active deception with my own daughter still pressed heavily on my chest. I needed to know exactly who my father had manipulated, and more importantly, whether Julian's name resided among the casualties or the conspirators. The initial dossiers had detailed municipal bribery and minor corporate espionage, ruinous for the individuals involved perhaps, but ultimately local. However, the fourth folder was twice as thick as the others. Its label read, Pine Ridge Acquisition, 1982. I smoothed the dry, brittle pages flat with my palms. The paper was stiff and unforgiving. According to the typed summaries, Pine Ridge had been a sprawling tract of undeveloped woodland south of the city, owned by a coalition of local farmers. My father's textile company had needed that land to build a massive new processing facility, but the farmers had adamantly refused to sell. The negotiations had stalled for months, and then, suddenly, they hadn't. I adjusted my reading glasses, squinting at the faded typewritten pages. My father had not simply raised his financial offer. Instead, he had employed an intermediary to systematically uncover the financial vulnerabilities of the coalition's leaders. One farmer had an undisclosed gambling debt, another was hiding substantial assets from a bitter divorce proceeding. A third had a son facing severe criminal charges that had quietly been made to disappear entirely. Emotion. The intermediary had gathered the leverage, documented it meticulously, and presented it to the farmers. Within 3 weeks, the coalition had collapsed. The land was sold to Pendelton Textiles for a fraction of its actual market value. I rubbed my jaw, my thumb dragging firmly against the harsh, prickly stubble on my chin. The mechanics of the extortion were appalling, a devastating betrayal of every moral lecture my father had ever delivered to me. But it was not the ruthless acquisition itself that caused my pulse to accelerate and my stomach to violently clench into a tight, nauseating knot. It was the identity of the intermediary. I flipped to the back of the dossier where the financial compensation for the operation was recorded. Attached was a faded carbon copy invoice for consulting services. The amount was staggering for 1982, enough to start a substantial commercial enterprise. And the signature at the bottom of the invoice, written in a bold, sweeping script that I recognized immediately, belonged to a man who had just begun building his own empire, Julian Vance. The realization landed with a physical weight, tightening my chest and making drawing breath momentarily difficult. Julian had not been a victim of my father's archive. He had been the architect of at least one of its most lucrative entries. He had earned his initial fortune by doing the dirty work that my father had orchestrated from a safe distance. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, the old springs groaning loudly in the quiet room. The bitter taste of the cold coffee suddenly seemed to carry a sharp, metallic edge, like biting down hard on a copper coin. The puzzle pieces were aggressively snapping into place, forming a picture that was profoundly ugly. The betrayal was absolute, tearing away the last shred of respect I held for the Pendleton name. Julian's visit this morning had not been a casual nostalgic trip. He had explicitly asked about old papers. He had specifically mentioned the attic. If Julian knew that my father had kept detailed records of the Pine Ridge extortion, he also knew that those records directly implicated him in massive, organized criminal activity. And Julian Vance had launched a political foundation. He was a prominent donor, a public figure carefully curating a pristine legacy. The documents sitting on my desk could permanently destroy him in a matter of hours. I stood up slowly, the muscles in my legs aching from hours of tense immobility. I walked over to the tall windows and stared out into the darkness. The rain was streaking aggressively down the glass, blurring the distant shadowy outlines of the estate's dead oak trees. The cold radiating from the glass seeped directly through my wool sweater, raising goosebumps on my arms. Emotions fathe noale. My father had kept these files as an insurance policy, a deterrent. He had locked them in an iron safe beneath the floorboards, confident that Julian Vance would never move against him as long as the leverage existed. But my father was dead. The truce had expired. I pressed my hand flat against the cold window pane. The glass was freezing, biting harshly into my warm skin. My reflection stared back at me, a tired, aging man who had spent his entire life managing an estate built on quiet sins. I had thought my father's secrets were a terrible burden. I now realized they were a loaded weapon, and Julian Vance was out there, calculating whether I knew how to fire it or whether he needed to violently silence me before I figured it out. I walked back to the desk and deliberately picked up the brass key. The metal was heavy and cold in my palm. The dull, sweeping anxiety that had been paralyzing me slowly began to harden, coalescing into something significantly different. It was no longer a profound, debilitating fear. It was a cold, sharp, and absolute determination. If Julian Vance believed he could intimidate me by appearing on my doorstep, he was severely underestimating the desperate resolve of a father who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I had lied to my daughter to keep her safely away from this poison. I had shattered my own fundamental understanding of my family's legacy. I refused to cower in this decaying manor, waiting to become Julian's next victim. I needed to know exactly how deep the corruption ran. I needed to know the identity of every single person my father had systematically ruined, and I needed to know which of them were still alive, because Julian Vance was clearly not the only dangerous predator haunting the margins of these aged documents. I sat back down heavily, pulling the leather chair forward. I opened the fifth folder, the brittle paper cracking loudly in the silent room. The smell of dust and decay felt thicker now, almost suffocating, but I completely ignored it. I took another slow sip of the intensely bitter coffee, staring sharply at the typewritten pages before me, my heart pounding with a steady, fierce rhythm. I was going to read every single word. I was going to memorize every single name. If this rotting house was built entirely on leverage, then it was time I finally learned exactly how to wield it. I stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, my hand hovering inches from the brass doorknob as the conversation bleeding through the wood slowly shattered everything I believed about my family. It was late August, 1982. A severe summer thunderstorm was aggressively hammering the manor, the heavy rain lashing against the corridor windows like a barrage of small stones. I was 33 years old, newly appointed as a junior vice president at Pendleton Textiles, and still deeply, foolishly eager to impress a father who treated his company as though it were a sovereign nation. I had brought the quarterly projections to his study to review before the morning board meeting. I had expected to find him entirely alone. Instead, the sharp, pungent smell of premium Cuban cigar smoke seeped out from under the heavy oak door, mixing unpleasantly with the sterile scent of floor wax in the corridor. My father never smoked cigars alone. It was a strictly social vice, reserved explicitly for celebrating brutal victories. I raised my hand to the cold metal of the doorknob, preparing to announce myself, when I heard a young, unexpectedly smooth voice from within the room. "The farmers will sell, Mr. Pendleton," the voice said. It was perfectly modulated, lacking any of the nervous deference people usually exhibited around my father, because men with gambling debts simply don't have the luxury of holding on to principles. My hand physically stopped moving. The brass knob felt freezing against my skin, sending a chill directly up my arm like a shot of ice water. I intimately knew that voice. It belonged to Julian Vance, an ambitious 30-year-old consultant who had recently begun circulating near the periphery of the city's financial elite. He was young, sharply dressed, and carried himself with a predatory ease that I had always found profoundly uncomfortable. "You have the documentation?" my father asked. His voice was low, authoritative, and completely devoid of any human empathy. It was exactly the kind of tone he used when inspecting defective textile machinery. "Everything is secured," Julian replied, his voice carrying a distinct, arrogant warmth. "Photographs of the casino markers, bank records showing the secondary mortgages, even a few recorded phone calls confirming the violent threats from his creditors. He's underwater by an amount he could never legally repay in a single lifetime." There was a sudden moment of silence, underscored only by the violent crash of thunder outside the manor. I bit the inside of my cheek, pressing my teeth against the soft flesh until a sharp, metallic taste of blood flooded my tongue. I swallowed it down, the warm liquid doing absolutely nothing to soothe the sudden hollow ache tightening violently in my stomach. The nausea felt as if the floor beneath me was dropping away. "And what about Miller?" my father asked coldly. "He's the loudest voice in their little coalition. He's keeping the others from breaking." "Miller was actually the easiest," Julian said smoothly. Through the narrow gap beneath the door, I saw a dark shadow shift against the band of yellow light. "He's funding a private clinic facility for a mistress in the neighboring county. It took merely 3 days to aggressively bribe a frantic nurse for the admission records and photograph the two of them passionately embracing in the parking lot. His wife comes from the wealthiest family in the district. If she files for divorce, he loses absolutely everything. He will be utterly destroyed." I pressed my back against the corridor wall, the wood paneling digging painfully into my spine. My breathing had become terribly shallow and erratic, my chest heaving as though entirely starved of oxygen. Pine Ridge. They were actively discussing the Pine Ridge acquisition, the massive woodland tract my father had been publicly negotiating to buy for the past 6 months. He had proudly told the board of directors, and he had looked me directly in the eye and told me that the deal would be secured through superior financial incentives and genuine community outreach. I was listening to the calculated, systematic destruction of innocent human lives. "Excellent work, Julian." The sound of a heavy glass decanter touching crystal echoed through the door, followed by the distinctive splash of scotch. My father was casually pouring him a drink. "A reward for extortion. Present the dossiers to them on Friday morning. Separately, of course. Give them 48 hours to unconditionally accept our initial financial offer for the land, or the files get mailed to the press, the furious creditors, and the heartbroken spouses simultaneously." "Consider it done," Julian said, the sharp clinking of glasses sealing the malicious contract. I slowly pulled my trembling hand away from the doorknob. The brass had grown warm beneath my palm, slick with my own nervous sweat. At 33, I had foolishly believed that I clearly understood the complex, often ruthless mechanics of the corporate world. I had desperately believed that behind my father's imposing exterior lay a solid foundation of strict moral integrity. I had fundamentally placed all my trust in the Pendelton legacy, built on honest hard work. But as I stood violently trembling in the dark shadows, listening to the low, terrifyingly satisfied laughter of Julian Vance and my father, casually trading toasts over the utterly ruined lives of ordinary men, a profound and horrifying sense of complete loss washed over me. It was a crushing weight upon my shoulders. The flawless hero I had intensely admired for over 3 decades violently vanished forever, instantly replaced by a calculated, remorseless monster who viewed human tragedy strictly as raw leverage. The betrayal was absolute, tearing away the last shred of respect I held. I did not boldly open the door. I simply turned entirely around, my dragging leather shoes perfectly silent on the thick Persian carpet, and walked away. I retreated into the darkest shadows of the manor. I told myself that I was walking away out of sheer debilitating shock. But as the bitter taste of blood lingered sharply in my dry mouth and the nauseating smell of premium cigar smoke faded into the cold, dusty air, the ugly, undeniable truth planted its roots deeply inside my broken spirit. I was an absolute coward. I had helplessly witnessed the terrifying reality of my family's foundation, and I had actively chosen to stay silent. The agonizing shame and immense guilt became an immediate burden. The fear of confrontation overrode every instinct of justice, emotion, I walked away filled with deep sorrow and dark despair, holding an empty hope that this was an anomaly. Instead, that stormy August night became the genesis of my deep, lingering grief and secret anger, a poisoned truth that would fester inside me for 25 years. Emotion warning, mornings time ago do. You said the plumbing was torn up, Dad, Eleanor said from the foyer, her sharp eyes scanning the perfectly intact floorboards. So why is the water running fine in the powder room? I froze halfway down the grand staircase. My hand gripped the polished wooden banister so tightly that a splinter of old mahogany bit painfully into my palm, sending a sharp sting through my skin. I had genuinely believed that my carefully constructed lies over the telephone on Friday would have bought me at least a month of absolute isolation. I had not accounted for Eleanor's relentless persistence. She stood near the front door, wearing a damp wool coat that gave off a faint musty smell of wet wool and city exhaust. A heavy leather overnight bag rested aggressively by her feet. Her lips were pressed tightly together, a severe physical tell she had exhibited since childhood whenever she caught me evading a direct question. The contractors cleaned up for the weekend, I said, my voice sounding incredibly hollow to my own ears. I descended the remaining stairs slowly, attempting to project a calm authority that I fundamentally did not possess. The bitter metallic taste of old coffee still lingered in the back of my dry mouth from a sleepless night spent pacing the study. They patched the immediate leaks. They'll be back on Monday to pull up the tiles. Eleanor's gaze snapped from the floorboards up to my face. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest. Right, and I suppose they also fixed the heating, because it's freezing in here. It's an old house, Elle. It's always cold in November. She dropped her overnight bag, the heavy thud echoing violently against the stone walls of the foyer. A sudden spike of terrible fear shot through my chest, an icy realization that my frantic deception was rapidly unraveling. I had spent the entire weekend cataloging the horrific depths of my father's blackmail archive, discovering the agonizing reality of the Pendelton fortune, and staring at Julian Vance's signature until my eyes ached. I was physically and emotionally exhausted, entirely unprepared to desperately defend my lies against an experienced prosecutor. Don't patronize me, Eleanor said rapidly, the cadence of her voice entirely unyielding. She took an aggressive step toward me. You sounded like a crazy person on the phone on Friday. Pausing for 10 seconds before answering basic questions, making up obvious excuses. And look at you, you haven't shaved in days, you look sick. I am perfectly fine, I lied again, though the words felt like a crushing weight on my shoulders. I rubbed my jaw, feeling the harsh, rough scrape of 3 days' worth of grey stubble against my fingers. The immense shame of actively deceiving my own daughter was a heavy burden, pressing down on me as if I were carrying the ruined lives of my father's victims on my own back. No, you're not, she countered, her right hand gesturing sharply in the air to emphasize her point. It was a courtroom tactic. You're completely isolating yourself in this enormous, decaying mausoleum. I'm taking 3 days off the campaign. I'm staying here until I figure out exactly what is going on with you. Panic violently seized my lungs. The fear was acute and paralyzing. The iron safe was still sitting in the study, utterly unlocked. The fifth folder, detailing the absolute destruction of a city judge in 1987, was currently spread across my father's desk in plain view. If Eleanor walked into that room, she would intimately see the monstrous foundation of her privilege. The profound loss of her respect would instantly destroy me. You cannot stay here, I said, my voice cracked, betraying the intense, debilitating anxiety clawing at my throat. Eleanor stopped abruptly, her posture rigidified, her sharp eyes narrowing as she scrutinized my face. The absolute silence in the foyer was deafening, broken only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Excuse me, she asked, her voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of its previous aggressive energy. It was a cold, forensic tone. I stepped off the bottom stair, desperately needing to create a physical barrier between her and the hallway leading to the study. The terrible necessity of protecting her from Julian Vance and the archive felt like a physical ache in my bones, a deep sorrow that I could never explicitly share. The house is not safe right now, I said, struggling to assemble a plausible narrative while my mind raced frantically. The contractors found black mold under the floorboards in the west wing, extensive colonies. They told me I needed to evacuate, but I stayed to oversee the remediation. If you stay here breathing this air, it could permanently jeopardize your health, and you cannot afford to get sick right before the final campaign push. It was a massive, desperate escalation of the lie. The guilt hit me instantly, a suffocating, hollow ache in my stomach, emotion. Eleanor stared at me, her head tilted slightly to the side. She reached up and tucked a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear, her fingers lingering there for a long moment. She was carefully evaluating the statement, searching for inconsistencies as though I were a hostile witness on the stand. Black mold, she repeated slowly. Yes, they're bringing in industrial scrubbers on Monday. But until then, the spores are in the ventilation system. She looked around the vast, empty space, her eyes tracking the high ceilings and the dark wood paneling. The scent of pine cleaner and old dust seemed to mock my terrible deception. Then why are you still here? She asked sharply. Why aren't you at a hotel? Because I need to protect the estate, I said. It was the only genuinely truthful statement I had uttered since she arrived. There are valuable things in this house, Eleanor. Things I cannot simply leave unguarded with strangers walking through the halls. The deep, unspoken truth of that statement settled heavily between us. I was guarding the very poison that could destroy her. My profound grief over what my father had actually built mingled with an intense, rising anger at my own incredible helplessness. I was frantically building a fortress of lies, sealing myself inside with the toxic secrets, all while desperately hoping she would just retreat. Eleanor let out a long, slow breath through her nose. She reached down and gripped the leather handles of her overnight bag, the knuckles on her hands turning completely white with tension. Fine, she snapped aggressively, the sudden hostility in her gesture radiating a deep, underlying hurt. She turned sharply toward the heavy oak door. If you want to play the eccentric, paranoid recluse, I can't forcefully stop you. But you are officially completely impossible. She pulled the door open, the biting chill of the November wind instantly sweeping into the foyer, bringing the sharp smell of damp earth and dead leaves. She did not look back at me. She marched down the stone steps, her boots striking the gravel with heavy, angry precision. I watched her throw the overnight bag into the trunk of her car and slam it shut with terrifying force. As the tires aggressively chewed the gravel and her car sped away down the long driveway, the brief relief of averting a catastrophic discovery vanished, violently replaced by a crushing despair. I closed the heavy front door, the solid thud loudly echoing through the completely silent manor. The isolation I had desperately fought for was finally absolute. Emotioned. I was entirely alone with the terrible secrets, entirely alone with the lingering threat of Julian Vance. And as I slowly walked back toward the dark study, the immense weight of the lies I had just successfully sold to my daughter settled firmly upon me, a permanent, agonizing burden that I knew would gradually tear me apart. Emotion. Timeout. I left my phone on the console table. Eleanor called out, her heels clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that made my chest tighten with sudden dread. I was standing at the kitchen sink, desperately splashing freezing water onto my face to wash away the bitter, sour taste of exhaustion and cold coffee. The front door had opened just 3 minutes after she had stormed out in a furious rage. I wiped my face with a rough, heavy cotton towel, the abrasive fabric scraping aggressively against my unshaven jaw. "It's right where you left it," I called back, my voice echoing slightly against the high, vaulted ceilings of the enormous manor. It was a terrible burden just to speak. The immense guilt of my previous lies sat in my stomach like a solid brick of lead, a crushing weight that made every breath an exhausting effort. I walked slowly toward the foyer, hoping she would simply grab the device and finally leave me in my isolated despair. The deep shadow of the hallway felt immensely cold, as if the house itself was actively shivering. As I turned the corner, I did not see Eleanor at the antique oak console table. Instead, she was standing perfectly still near the base of the grand staircase, exactly where we had argued moments ago. The sharp, damp smell of wet wool from her coat mixed distinctly with the scent of old floor wax. Then I saw it. Resting in her hands was a single sheet of dry, yellowed parchment. Its corners were slightly curled, the faded typewritten font distinctly visible even in the dim light. It was the summary sheet for the 1987 judicial blackmail operation. I had shoved the 5th dossier under my arm when I originally hurried out of the study, and that loose page must have silently fluttered to the floor during our tense confrontation. My heart slammed violently against my ribs, an intense hollow ache radiating through my chest. The fear was absolutely paralyzing, washing over my numbed brain like a bucket of freezing water. Eleanor's posture had completely transformed. The furious, impatient stance of a campaign manager had aggressively morphed into something significantly sharper. She was holding the aged document inches from her face, her eyes violently darting back and forth across the typewritten lines. Her lips parted slightly, and she raised her free hand to deliberately trace her finger across the heavily redacted names at the bottom of the page. Emotion. "Tense, Eleanor," I said, my voice barely a cracked whisper. It sounded exactly like the plea of a guilty, defeated man. She looked up. Her brown eyes were wide, the pupils noticeably dilated in the gloomy foyer. The profound curiosity radiating from her rigid posture was terrifyingly intense. She took a slow, deliberate step toward me, brandishing the brittle page as though it were a weapon. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping into a low, completely focused register. The rapid, staccato rhythm of her usual speech was gone. "What exactly is this?" "It's nothing," I said immediately, instinctively reaching out my hand to forcefully take it back. "It's just old legal documentation from your grandfather's estate processing." I dropped it when I was trying to pack it away in a box. She took a quick, evasive step backward, her leather heels sharply striking the floorboards. She aggressively pulled the paper tightly against her chest. The motion was entirely defensive, highly uncharacteristic for her. "Don't lie to me again," Eleanor snapped, the volume of her voice spiking sharply in the quiet hallway. "This isn't an estate document. It explicitly outlines a surveillance operation on a sitting judge. It references photographic negatives safely secured in a vault. It clearly lists financial routing numbers and explicit leverage points." "Eleanor, give it to me," I demanded. My intense fear was rapidly metastasizing into a desperate, furious anger. I stepped forward, holding my hand out firmly. My palm was sweating profusely, the skin feeling slick and incredibly cold. She did not hand it over. Instead, she aggressively waved the yellowed paper in the air, the dry parchment making a distinct, sharp crackling sound that snapped through the heavy silence. "Is this why you're frantically trying to push me out of the house?" she demanded, her sharp hand gestures aggressively slicing through the air between us. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "You claimed it was black mold. You claimed it was hazardous. But you're actually sitting in here reading decades-old extortion records. You do not profoundly understand what you are holding," I shouted, the sudden anger completely overriding my usual measured cadence. The profound betrayal of my father's legacy felt as if it were aggressively burning the very air out of my lungs. I was fighting a desperate battle to protect her from the devastating consequences of Julian Vance's potential knowledge, but her relentless curiosity was actively dragging her directly into the crosshairs. Eleanor stared at my terrified, flushed face for a long moment. She slowly lowered the hand holding the document, her breathing visibly accelerating. She looked down at the paper, then back up at the dark hallway leading toward my father's study. "There's more of this, isn't there?" she asked. Her tone was no longer accusatory. It was intensely, dangerously investigative. The fierce curiosity in her voice was entirely unbounded, driven by the profound shock of discovering physical proof that her family harbored sinister secrets. "No," I lied, though the agonizing shame of my deception tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. "That is the only one. Give it back gently, Elle." Eleanor slowly folded the brittle parchment precisely in half, the sharp crease cracking loudly in the quiet space. She did not hand it to me. She aggressively slid it into the deep, dark pocket of her wool coat, her jaw set in a rigid, completely immovable line. "I am not leaving this house," she stated firmly, her voice carrying an absolute, terrifyingly focused resolve. She deliberately turned her back entirely on the front door and walked confidently past me, her boots sounding like an aggressive march as she headed directly toward the living room. The deep, overwhelming sorrow hit me like a physical blow. The absolute loss of my protective barrier was devastating. Eleanor had tasted the poison of the Pendelton archive, and I knew with a terrifying, agonizing certainty that her incredibly dangerous curiosity would never allow her to stop until she had completely unearthed the monstrous monster resting beneath the floorboards. Emotion. "Your father has always possessed a rather vivid, paranoid imagination, Eleanor." Julian Vance's smooth voice drifted through the glass doors of the lobby, stopping me dead in my tracks. I stood completely frozen at the outer entrance of Eleanor's downtown campaign headquarters. The bitter, freezing city wind whipped violently around my ankles as the heavy electric automatic doors slid open and closed, catching me in the harsh threshold. The massive building lobby was expansive, echoing, and aggressively sterile, smelling sharply of industrial bleach, wet wool coats, and the stale aroma of cheap coffee drifting from a nearby kiosk. I had driven frantically into the city the morning after our disastrous argument, desperately hoping to somehow explain the unexplainable before her relentless, inherent drive for answers triggered a catastrophic chain reaction that I could not control. Instead, to my absolute horror, I found Julian Vance already there. He stood casually near the highly polished marble security desk, completely blocking Eleanor's direct path to the elevators. At 55, Julian looked exactly like a man who spent considerable fortunes ensuring his absolute comfort and dominance. His bespoke navy suit fit him immaculately, draping perfectly over a frame that had not aged quite as harshly as mine. The harsh fluorescent lights of the lobby caught the subtle, expensive gleam of silver as he idly, deliberately toyed with his heavy cufflinks. Beside him, Eleanor looked visibly tense, repeatedly shifting her weight and clutching the thick leather strap of her campaign briefcase, so tightly her pale knuckles were entirely white. "He thinks there's black mold in the manor," Eleanor said, her voice rapid and intense, bouncing aggressively off the polished marble walls. "He looks terribly sick, Julian. He wouldn't even let me pass the foyer, and he dropped a piece of paper that it made absolutely no rational sense. It looked exactly like a surveillance report." I pressed my shoulder firmly against the cold glass of the vestibule wall, the frigid temperature biting deeply into my skin like a dozen sharp, unforgiving needles. A heavy, hollow ache spread aggressively through my chest, making it profoundly difficult to draw breath. The bitter, coppery taste of metallic fear flooded my painfully dry mouth, as if I had swallowed pure adrenaline and panic. Eleanor was actively pursuing the mystery, genuinely focused on unraveling the yellowed paper's dark, devastating meaning, entirely ignorant of the terrifying reality that she was openly questioning the very architect of the extortion. "A surveillance report?" Julian asked, letting out a low, deeply sympathetic chuckle that was perfectly calibrated to disarm her natural defenses. "Oh, Eleanor, your grandfather kept extensive, obsessive records of competing textile mills. Emotion. We used to frequently joke that he genuinely thought he was running a private intelligence agency. That old manor is completely filled from floorboards to attic with dusty boxes of entirely useless paranoid scribblings." Eleanor's fiercely protective posture wavered slightly at his warm tone. She shifted her weight again, explicitly gesturing sharply with her free hand to slice through his dismissal. But he was acting extraordinarily defensive. He literally shouted at me to give it back. I have never seen my father look genuinely terrified before. "Of course he did," Julian replied, his voice smoothly dropping into a gentle, purely paternal register that made a heavy wave of pure nausea violently crash through my churning stomach. "Your father has been living completely isolated in that massive, decaying house ever since the estate finally settled. Terrible isolation consistently breeds terrible anxiety. The mind plays deeply unfortunate tricks on a man who spends his days entirely alone in the dark. I've closely known Arthur since we were young men exploring the city. When the intense pressure of reality becomes a significant burden, he helplessly retreats into these strange, secretive little delusions." I closed my eyes tight, the agonizing shame burning violently, painfully in my throat. Julian was smoothly, effortlessly planting toxic seeds of deep doubt, systematically weaponizing my recent frantic behavior against me. He was deliberately painting my desperate attempt to aggressively protect her as the tragic decline of an aged, mentally unstable recluse. My profound despair deepened as I realized how flawlessly the calculated narrative fit my erratic actions. "You really think he's slowly losing his grip?" Eleanor asked. There was a sudden, devastating crack in her usually rapid, authoritative cadence. The incredible certainty that had fueled her fury and driven her out of the manor yesterday was currently evaporating, violently replaced by a profound, terrifying confusion. Julian reached out and lightly, comfortingly touched her shoulder. The gesture was a horrific violation of my profound trust, a terrible betrayal playing out explicitly before my very eyes. Seeing his hand on my daughter felt exactly like watching a snake coil precisely around a vulnerable dove. "I deeply think he struggles with the crushing weight of reality," Julian said softly, perfectly playing the flawless role of the benevolent old family friend. He sees dangerous threats that simply do not logically exist outside his own head. If he shows you any more of these bizarre surveillance papers, Eleanor, I strongly, emphatically suggest you just humor him gently. Do not engage with his panicked fantasies. Challenging delusions forcefully will only accelerate and severely worsen his mental condition. Eleanor let out a long, slow, deeply uncertain breath. Her brown eyes darted rapidly toward the polished metal of the elevators, then back down to the gleaming floor tiles. The fierce, unyielding determination to uncover the dark family truth had visibly fractured, giving way entirely to a blinding, conflicting storm of deep doubt. "I just want to ensure he's genuinely safe," she whispered softly, her voice tightening rapidly with genuine sorrow and unexpected grief. "And he absolutely is," Julian confidently assured her. He finally stepped aside gracefully, cleanly giving her open access to the elevators. "Focus entirely on your campaign, Eleanor. You have a long road ahead of you. Leave Arthur's eccentricities to me. I'll properly check on him. I'll make sure he isn't a danger to himself." Eleanor nodded slowly. The aggressive, ambitious prosecutor had been effectively, totally neutralized by a few smoothly delivered lies wrapped perfectly in manufactured compassion. She walked slowly toward the waiting elevators, constantly looking over her right shoulder, her face a heartbreaking portrait of deep, agonizing confusion. She fundamentally did not know who or what the actual threat logically was anymore. Julian stood motionless and watched the heavy elevator doors close tightly behind her. As soon as the polished metal completely shut, the warm, deeply sympathetic expression violently vanished from his face, instantly and horrifyingly replaced by a cold, calculating mask of absolute ruthlessness. He smoothly adjusted his expensive cufflinks one final, arrogant time, smiled faintly to himself, and turned briskly toward the main lobby exit. I shrank back rapidly into the deep, frozen shadows of the glass vestibule, my cold hands shaking uncontrollably as a profound, agonizing despair entirely washed over my broken soul. The tragic, abrupt loss of Eleanor's trust was a terrifying consequence I could absolutely never have anticipated when I decided to hide the horrific ledger. Julian Vance had not simply effortlessly neutralized her dangerous investigation, he had actively poisoned her core perception of me. I stood entirely alone in the freezing winter cold, crushed heavily beneath the incredible, suffocating burden of my own desperate lies, intimately knowing that if I ever finally tried to tell my daughter the devastating truth about the Pendleton archive, she would absolutely never logically believe me. Emotion. The sharp, metallic shriek of the filing cabinet drawer echoed against the damp walls, catching my breath in the unnatural silence of the basement study. The freezing outdoor air clung stubbornly to my heavy coat, radiating a dull, icy dampness. I tossed my keys onto the scarred mahogany desk, the metal ring clattering harshly. My chest heaved with jagged breaths. I pressed my palm against my forehead, but the image of Julian Vance's face, that cold mask of absolute ruthlessness smiling outside Eleanor's workplace, remained burned into my eyelids. The terror I harbored was no longer a distant memory locked in old case files. Perhaps it was a living entity standing entirely too close to my daughter. I sank down onto the cracked leather chair, rubbing my jaw so hard the stubble scraped painfully against my palm. I ran my fingers over the worn edges of the desk. My eyes locked onto the solid steel safe tucked securely beneath the floorboards. The oriental rug covering it lay perfectly flat. At a glance, everything looked pristine. I pushed the heavy chair back, the casters groaning in violent protest against the hard concrete floor. Kneeling down, I threw the rug aside. The brass dial on the safe gleamed mockingly under the pale glow, glowing like a beacon of my past failures. My thumbs gripped the cold dial. 3 turns right, 32, 2 turns left, 14, 1 turn right, 79. The deadbolts retracted with a satisfying clunk. I pulled the heavy steel door open, the hinges squealing faintly in the damp air. Inside lay the thick leather-bound ledger. The gold lettering on the spine had faded into a dull brown over the decades of hidden shame. I lifted the heavy book, its physical burden incredibly oppressive in my shaking hands, and placed it onto the desk. The deep ache in my bones reminded me of the sorrow I had buried. I flicked open the oxidized brass clasps. The ancient paper released a stale odor. My index finger traced the meticulous columns of numbers and names. Page after page spelled out the illicit transactions, the concealed bribes, the names of the innocent men destroyed by Julian's endless rage. I turned the crisp pages with slow precision. Page 41, page 42. My breathing snagged in my throat. Emotion. Page 43. The crucial entry detailing the offshore accounts was missing. I stared blankly at the jagged white edge where the thick paper had been cleanly torn from the tight binding. A sharp, crushing pressure clamped down hard on my lungs, as if the remaining air had been instantly vacuumed away. I flipped the book over, wildly shaking it. Nothing fell out. I ran my trembling hand along the freshly torn edge. The rip was crisp, recent. The sheer betrayal of my security measures left a hollow void in my chest. My knuckles turned bone white against the edge of the mahogany desk. The crushing guilt abruptly replaced the oxygen in my lungs. The paralyzing fear gripped me. I clamped my eyes shut, and I tasted the bile of pure despair. My safety net had unraveled, breaking apart as though it never existed. The list of suspects was terrifyingly short. The house alarm remained armed all day. The combination existed only in my head. Eleanor. 3 days ago, I had found her holding a meaningless stack of mail near the study door. She had asked casually about the old days, the specific way she tilted her head, a textbook police interrogation tactic she had learned from her mother. She had the combination. She used to watch me deeply when she was a young child. The devastating weight crashes over me. Maybe I should have told her the truth years ago. Something about her recent behavior finally made brutal sense. She took the damning page to investigate the cartel on her own. My own blood, actively digging into the lethal Pendelton archive without any protection. The agonizing grief of my own failure tightened around my throat. A sharp ring abruptly shattered the silence. The old rotary phone on the desk vibrated violently. I snatched the heavy plastic receiver, pressing it brutally against my ear. Arthur, the smooth, cultured voice hummed through the crackling earpiece. Julian. Such a lovely evening. I gripped the spiraled cord, wrapping it extremely tight around my knuckles, pulling until the tough plastic bit into my flesh. I said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and lethal. I just had the most delightful conversation with your daughter, Julian continued, the fabricated warmth dripping like poison from every carefully articulated syllable. A remarkably bright young woman, so intensely curious about local history. A freezing cold sweat broke out across my forehead, stinging my eyes. I stared directly at the torn edge in the ledger while the hard plastic receiver dug into the side of my face. The sheer terror of his proximity to her paralyzed my vocal cords. We talked extensively about the past, Arthur. Julian's voice dropped an octave, the false warmth completely evaporating. She asked some very interesting questions. Questions that suggest she might have stumbled upon some incomplete information that could be quite dangerous if misunderstood in the wrong hands. I uncoiled the cord from my aching hand. Julian, my voice came out as a low, gravelly rasp. She is entirely in over her head, old friend, Julian said in a low whisper that sent a violent shudder down my spine. The world is full of terrible accidents. Careless drivers on wet roads, faulty wiring in old apartments. You know how quickly a bright light can be permanently extinguished in a fraction of a second. The line went completely dead. The rhythmic dial tone buzzed aggressively in my ear. I slowly lowered the receiver, placing it back onto the black cradle. The plastic clicked solidly into place, a definitive period on the end of a death threat. I looked down at my hands. They were flat and terrifyingly steady against the dark wood. The paralyzing fear had abruptly crystallized into absolute icy clarity. The passive waiting over the last decade had officially ended. I pushed the ledger aside, opening the bottom drawer of the desk to reveal the small, heavy lockbox. I unlocked it with a tiny key. Inside rested a sleek, black steel revolver and 2 heavy boxes of ammunition. The metallic smell of gun oil and brass filled the stagnant air. I picked up the cold metal weapon. The weight felt undeniably necessary against my palm. I snapped the cylinder open, sliding the heavy brass cartridges methodically into the dark chambers. The sharp, metallic clicks echoed through the room like the ticking of a doomsday clock. I snapped the cylinder shut with a flick of my wrist, the sound carrying a terrible, irreversible finality. Julian Vance had explicitly drawn the battle lines around my daughter, and as I stared at the loaded weapon in my hand, the terrifying reality set in. Blood was going to spill tonight, and the only remaining question was whose. Emotion. The heavy brass elevator doors slid open with a muted hum. revealing the expansive, sterile marble foyer of Julian Vance's penthouse. My heavy leather boots clipped echoing thuds against the pristine black stone. The cold steel of the loaded revolver pressed sharply against my ribs, concealed beneath the heavy wool of my coat. The phantom weight of the weapon anchored me. The metallic taste of pure rage coated my tongue, a raw, undeniable anger that drowned out decades of careful diplomacy. I gripped the thick fabric of my pockets, staring down the long hallway. Julian sat casually on a sleek white leather sofa near the floor-to-ceiling windows, framed by the glittering panoramic view of the city skyline. The city lights cast long shadows across the polished floor. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking completely relaxed. The sheer audacity of his comfort ignited a fresh surge of fury inside my chest. He held a heavy crystal decanter, pouring a steady stream of amber liquid into a lowball glass. The clinking ice echoed through the massive room. "Arthur," Julian said smoothly, entirely without surprise. His velvet voice carried no trace of the threat he had issued over the phone an hour ago. "You bypassed security again. You always were remarkably resourceful. Can I pour you a drink? You look incredibly tense." I kept my distance, remaining near the marble island of the open kitchen. The distance between us felt volatile, like a live wire sparking on damp concrete. I rubbed my jaw, my fingers dragging against the rough stubble. The friction offered a tiny distraction from the boiling pressure beneath my ribs. "What do you want, Julian?" I asked, my voice holding a steady, measured cadence despite the violent tremors shaking my hands. "Leave Eleanor out of this." Julian chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. He gently swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I simply had a conversation with her, Arthur. She is a bright young woman, highly ambitious, the kind of ambition that requires proper guidance." He set his glass down onto the glass coffee table. The resulting click sounded louder than a gunshot. He began absent-mindedly toying with his expensive gold cufflinks, twisting the metal with practiced, smooth motions. "She has the missing page," Julian stated, dropping the pleasantries. His eyes, cold and entirely devoid of empathy, locked onto mine. "The singular page that connects my current infrastructure to those unfortunate events. The page you promised to keep hidden." The crushing guilt of exposing her to his world tightened my throat. "She knows nothing. She doesn't understand what she's looking at. The ledger is mine." "Perhaps she doesn't understand it yet," Julian replied, remaining perfectly still. "But she will. She is digging, Arthur. She is drawing attention. And attention is a massive liability. The kind of liability I refuse to tolerate." I took a slow step forward, planting my feet firmly. The leather of my boots squeaked slightly. "If you touch her, Julian, if you even look in her direction—" "Or what?" Julian interrupted, leaning back into the white leather sofa. He raised one eyebrow, an expression of pure, arrogant amusement. "You will shoot me, here, in my penthouse. There are exactly 14 cameras between the lobby and this floor. The grief of losing her father to a life sentence in a federal prison would absolutely ruin her." Maybe he was right. The logic was sound. The agonizing sorrow of that reality flashed behind my eyes. The fear of ruining her life clashed violently with my instinct to strike. I gripped the cold metal in my pocket, my knuckles aching from the intense pressure. I had hoped to bluff him. I had prayed that my sheer physical presence, the threat of immediate violence, would force him to back down. Something about his relaxed posture, however, signaled that negotiation was entirely off the table. Julian smoothly adjusted his cufflinks again. "I am not going to kill her, Arthur. That is sloppy. We are civilized men. But her career, her reputation, her entire future in the department?" He smiled, a thin, cruel stretching of lips. "I can have internal affairs tear her life apart by tomorrow morning. I can plant evidence so deeply in her apartment that she will face 20 years for corruption. The shame will break her." The hollow feeling in my stomach expanded, vast and cold. The betrayal of an old friend stung less than the devastating realization of my own impotence. My desperate attempt at diplomacy had failed completely. The ache in my aging bones reminded me of all the battles I had lost. I stared at him, the rage solidifying into an icy, unmovable core within my chest. "Bring me the page, Arthur," Julian said softly. He picked up his glass and took a slow sip. "Bring me the page by midnight tomorrow. If you fail, her career ends. If she keeps digging, worse things will happen. Do we understand each other?" I remained silent. The desperate hope of a peaceful resolution evaporated completely, leaving behind nothing but the stark, brutal reality. The sorrow of the past decades vanished, replaced entirely by an animalistic urge to protect my blood. I realized, as though looking at a stranger, that the man sitting across from me possessed absolutely no moral boundaries. The thick despair morphed instantly into pure, calculated malice. I turned my back to him, my boots heavy against the marble. I did not say another word. Walking back toward the brass elevator doors, the mechanical hum of the approaching car filled the silence. The battle was no longer about hiding the truth. The rules had completely changed. The descent in the elevator was agonizingly slow. The polished brass doors reflected my distorted image, a stark reminder of the man I had become. The sterile scent of the penthouse lingered in the confined space, mingling with the faint smell of gun oil from my coat. My jaw throbbed incessantly. The city lights blurred outside the glass walls of the elevator shaft, a chaotic smear of color against the dark night. I rubbed the back of my neck, trying to ease the rigid tension locking my muscles in place. Every ticking second felt heavy, laden with the impossible weight of Julian's ultimatum. The raw guilt tore at my conscience. Eleanor's bright, ambitious face flashed through my mind, followed immediately by the terrifying image of her locked inside an interrogation room, her career meticulously dismantled by fabricated evidence. Julian possessed the exact resources to execute his threat flawlessly. The deep hollow ache in my chest spread outwards, chilling my extremities. I shifted my weight, the hard edge of the revolver biting into my hip. The weapon, once a symbol of decisive action, now felt entirely useless against the insidious nature of the blackmail. The elevator finally reached the lobby with a soft chime. The doors slid apart, revealing the expansive, brightly lit expanse of the ground floor. The night guard barely glanced up as I strode past. The cold night air hit me the moment I pushed through the revolving glass doors. Seeking a peaceful resolution had been my greatest mistake. Perhaps I had grown naive over the years, assuming the old rules of engagement still applied. But looking up at the illuminated penthouse, I knew the bitter truth. Julian would never freely stop. Was I truly prepared to cross that line? The burning rage inside me settled into a terrifyingly cold resolve. There was nothing left to discuss. Either he was going to end up dead, or I was. The rusted iron hinges of the crypt door shrieked violently into the stillness of the night, a sound that resonated deep into my bones. The freezing damp air of the subterranean tunnel immediately bit at the exposed skin of my neck. I carried the heavy canvas duffel bag over my shoulder, the thick strap painfully digging into my collarbone. Inside the bag, wrapped in layers of thick industrial plastic, sat the Pendelton ledger. The sheer weight of the book felt different now. In the sterile light of my basement safe, it had been a source of shame. Down here, in the suffocating shadows clinging to the damp limestone walls, it transformed into the only leverage standing between Eleanor and complete destruction. I descended the ancient, uneven stone steps one at a time. The weak yellow beam of my tactical flashlight sliced through the oppressive darkness, illuminating thick tapestries of cobwebs and the slow, rhythmic drip of groundwater. The smell of wet earth and slow decay filled the long corridor. The vulnerability that had paralyzed me just hours ago inside Julian's glittering penthouse was completely gone. The agonizing grief over an old friendship had been surgically removed. Maybe I had been foolish to believe that diplomacy was still an option. Perhaps the years of quiet retirement had dulled my survival instincts. But as the icy draft from the deep crypt washed over my face, the burning rage inside me hardened into absolute, unbreakable resolve. I reached the bottom of the staircase, my heavy boots splashing lightly into a shallow puddle. The old Pendleton crypt stretched out before me, a labyrinth of stone arches and deeply recessed alcoves built by my great-grandfather. I walked past the weathered stone sarcophagi, my flashlight tracing the worn Latin inscriptions. The deep ache in my hands faded as I gripped the heavy canvas bag tighter. Julian Vance believed he commanded the entire board. He believed the threat of ruining Eleanor's career would break my spirit. Something about his arrogant, relaxed posture told me he expected a complete surrender. I stopped before the third alcove on the eastern wall. Unlike the others, this tomb was unmarked, a solid block of granite sealed with heavy iron brackets. I knelt on the cold, wet stone, dropping the canvas bag beside me with a dull thud. From my heavy coat pocket, I retrieved a long steel pry bar. The cold metal transferred its icy temperature directly into my scarred palms. I wedged the flat edge of the steel beneath the rusted iron bracket, throwing the entire weight of my body into the lever. The ancient mortar groaned. The sharp, terrifying sound of breaking stone echoed aggressively down the long, empty tunnel. A deep, hollow void seemed to open behind the heavy block. Emotion. I repositioned the bar, grinding my teeth together, and pushed again. The heavy granite block shifted outward with a harsh grinding noise, exposing a dark, rectangular cavity within the wall. The stench of stagnant, trapped air immediately flooded my nostrils. I coughed, tasting the dust of centuries on my tongue. The sorrow of defacing my ancestors' resting place was a fleeting thought, instantly replaced by the terrifying necessity of the moment. I picked up the heavy canvas bag, running my hands over the thick plastic wrapping one final time. Every name, every illicit transaction, every piece of damning evidence that could orchestrate Julian's downfall rested inside. The guilt of harboring these secrets for decades vanished. It was absolutely essential to weaponize the truth. I shoved the bag deep into the dark cavity. It slid smoothly over the rough stone, disappearing into the pitch-black recess. I grabbed the heavy granite block, wrapping my thick, calloused fingers around the jagged edges. The raw physical exertion burned in my biceps. I dragged the massive stone back into its original position, the friction creating a shower of fine, powdery dust. The block settled perfectly flush against the surrounding wall. In the dim, wavering light of the flashlight, the seal looked completely undisturbed. I stood up, my knees cracking aggressively in the quiet space. I rubbed my jaw, wiping away a thin layer of grime and cold sweat. The manor was no longer simply a home. It had officially become a fortress under siege. The transition was complete. To anyone else, the crypt was a forgotten relic. To me, it was the vault that secured Eleanor's future. The paralyzing despair had entirely evaporated. The intense, gnawing fear had transformed, as though struck by lightning, into tactical precision. I aimed the flashlight down the long corridor, tracing the erratic path back toward the iron door. Every ticking second felt heavily charged with violence. Julian possessed the exact resources to execute his insidious blackmail by midnight tomorrow. He expected me to walk through his brass elevator doors and hand over my only shield. But he did not know the man standing in this freezing crypt. He did not know the lengths a desperate father would go to protect his blood. I climbed the stone steps, my boots striking the rock with heavy, rhythmic thuds. Emotion. The rusted iron door waited at the top. I pushed the heavy metal open, slipping back into the relatively warm air of the manor's basement. I slammed the door shut, throwing the heavy deadbolt with a resounding crack. Like a soldier preparing for an imminent siege, I walked toward my desk. The sleek black revolver lay exactly where I had left it. I picked it up, the familiar weight settling perfectly into my grip. Diplomacy was dead. I stared at the locked door leading up to the main house. The battle lines were explicitly drawn. If Julian Vance came looking for the ledger before his midnight deadline, what wouldn't he destroy to get it? The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to elongate, stretching toward me like grasping fingers. There was absolutely nothing left to negotiate, but as I checked the loaded cylinder one last time, a dark, terrible thought surfaced. Was I truly prepared to pull the trigger? I knew the bitter truth. Either the monster in the penthouse was going to bleed, or I was. The silence of the house pressed inwardly on my eardrums. The ancient grandfather clock on the floor above chimed the hour, a deep resonant sound that vibrated through the wooden beams. It was 4 in the morning. The overwhelming fatigue that should have accompanied a sleepless night was entirely absent, replaced instead by a hyper-vigilant adrenaline. I moved methodically across the study, turning off the single desk lamp. The room plunged into absolute darkness, save for the faint silvery moonlight spilling through the narrow ground-level windows. I pressed my back against the cold concrete wall, the revolver resting solidly against my thigh. The strategic positioning allowed me a clear line of sight to both the main staircase door and the reinforced steel exit leading to the backyard. The vulnerability of the open space was gone. I was practically invisible in the deep shadows. The quiet rhythm of my own breathing served as my only companion. I closed my eyes, visualizing the precise layout of the property, the heavy oak doors, the gravel driveway, the blind spots near the old carriage house. If Julian sent his private security contractors before dawn, they would find the perimeter securely locked, but the man inside waiting. The quiet ticking of the doomsday clock continued in my head, counting down the hours until Julian's insidious deadline. The siege had officially begun, and I was exactly where I needed to be. The heavy oak front door slammed shut with a concussive boom, rattling the frosted glass panes and shattering the quiet dawn. I quickly shoved the heavy black revolver beneath the scattered daily newspapers on my desk, my pulse spiking aggressively. The sharp, rapid click of Eleanor's heels against the hardwood floor advanced down the hallway. I dragged a trembling hand down my face, dragging my fingers through the rough stubble. The quiet siege of the night was over, replaced instantly by the terrifying reality of the morning. Eleanor stormed into the study, her dark wool trench coat still buttoned to her chin. Pale morning sunlight fractured through the dust-covered blinds, casting severe, prison-like bars of light across the scarred mahogany floor. She stopped right in front of the desk, her posture rigid. She threw her leather briefcase onto the leather sofa with a sharp thud. "Why did Julian Vance ask about my promotion, Dad?" Eleanor's voice cut through the stagnant air. She spoke rapidly, the words tumbling out sharply. Her hands moved in quick, sharp gestures as she emphasized her confusion. "He came to my precinct yesterday. He specifically mentioned my upcoming review board." The bitter taste of rising bile coated the back of my throat. I stared at the scattered newspapers, visually ensuring the cold steel of the gun remained completely hidden. The devastating grief of my own failure tightened my chest. I had spent the entire night preparing for armed mercenaries, bracing for a physical assault on the manor. I had completely underestimated the psychological warfare Julian had proactively launched against my daughter. "Julian is a powerful man," I said, forcing my voice to maintain its usual slow, measured cadence. I rubbed my jaw, trying to massage away the intense ache radiating through my teeth. "He frequently takes an interest in the local department. It is merely politics." Eleanor leaned over the desk, planting her palms flat against the wood. "Do not lie to me, not today." Her eyes narrowed, the calculating gaze scanning my exhausted face. He knew about the missing internal affairs files from 1998. He hinted that my career trajectory could experience a very sudden drop if I kept looking into the old Pendelton archive. Why would an esteemed philanthropist care about a 20-year-old cold case? The hollow cavity in my stomach expanded. The crushing guilt that I had buried for a decade forcefully resurfaced. Eleanor's fierce, protective nature was blinding her to the absolute peril she was navigating blindly. Seeking a peaceful resolution had been my greatest mistake. Perhaps I should have destroyed the ledger years ago. Something about her unyielding posture explicitly demanded the truth. Emotion. The dark shadows pooling in the corners of the study seemed to mock my absolute impotence. I pushed the heavy leather chair back, the casters sinking into the thick carpet. "Eleanor, you need to stop investigating the archive immediately. You need to drop the case." "No." She threw her hands in the air, a sharp, dismissive wave. "I am finally finding concrete evidence of cartel bribery inside the mayor's office. The missing pages in your old files represent the missing link. I just need to find the original ledger." The sheer terror of her proximity to the lethal truth paralyzed my vocal cords. She was walking directly into a minefield without a map. The agonizing sorrow of exposing my darkest compromises threatened to completely break my resolve. The shame burned across my cheeks, a hot, prickling sensation that made me want to look away. But I forced myself to maintain eye contact. The impenetrable armor of secrecy I had worn for decades finally began to crack under the devastating weight of my daughter's undeniable danger. "There is no missing link," I whispered, the words scraping painfully against my dry throat. "The ledger never made it to the evidence locker." Eleanor froze, her hands dropped slowly to her sides. The intense, rapid energy drained rapidly from her posture. She tilted her head, her sharp eyes studying me as though looking at a complete stranger. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that Julian Vance did not simply fund the bribery ring," I confessed, the agonizing betrayal of my own badge hanging heavily in the quiet room. "He orchestrated it, and I helped him cover it up." I took the ledger, Eleanor. The absolute silence that followed was suffocating. The slow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded uncomfortably loud. Eleanor stumbled backward, her heel catching slightly on the edge of the oriental rug. The sheer disbelief washing over her bright face felt exactly like a physical blow to my ribs. The thick despair morphed instantly into pure vulnerability. "You," Eleanor breathed out, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You hid the evidence. You let those innocent officers go to federal prison? I had to protect our family, I pleaded, the desperate sound of my own voice echoing harshly. I stood up, gripping the edge of the desk. The ache in my aging bones reminded me of the immense burden I had carried alone. Julian threatened your mother. Tensni wovi you woe. The cartel possessed the exact resources to execute his threat flawlessly. The deep hollow ache in my chest. You have no idea what it felt like. I made a deal to keep you alive. She shook her head violently, taking another step back toward the open doorway. You compromised the entire department. Everything you taught me about the law, it was a complete lie. The absolute disgust in her tone slashed through my remaining defenses. The raw vulnerability of the moment completely shattered my stoic facade. Julian knows you are looking for it, I continued, my voice gaining a desperate urgency. He knows you took the ripped page from my safe. That is why he visited your precinct. He is going to systematically destroy your career, and if that fails, he will kill you. You are dealing with a man who possesses absolutely no moral boundaries. Eleanor stared at the scarred mahogany floor, her shoulders trembling slightly beneath the heavy wool coat. The silence stretched, heavy and lethal. The fragile trust between us lay completely decimated upon the floor. As I looked at my brilliant, ambitious daughter, I intimately understood the true cost of my silence. Unveiling the truth had not saved her. It had only drafted her into a war she never asked for. Maybe she would turn me in. Perhaps the agonizing guilt was finally catching up to me. Was she going to walk out the heavy oak door and never return? She slowly raised her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a terrifyingly cold intensity. The tears standing in her eyes completely evaporated. But she did not reach for her radio, nor did she run. The paralyzing fear had abruptly crystallized into something far more dangerous. What was she going to do now? There was nothing left to hide, nothing but the blood we shared. The air between us grew impossibly heavy, suffocating any chance of reconciliation. The morning sunlight cast severe bars across the floor, reflecting the trap we were both locked inside. My hands shook uncontrollably as I braced against the desk. For 20 years I had maintained the illusion of the incorruptible detective, the steadfast pillar of the Pendelton name. The agonizing shame of watching that heroic image die violently in my daughter's eyes was a punishment worse than any prison sentence Julian Vance could have orchestrated. Emotion. I wanted to physically pull her into an embrace and promise that everything would be flawlessly resolved, but the vast, icy canyon of my betrayal effectively separated us. I remained entirely frozen, heavily burdened by the ghosts of the innocent men I had failed to protect. Amosend mulev amosend mais everless smate. The heavy scent of splintered mahogany and ozone hit my nose the exact moment I pushed open the heavy oak door to the study. The brass hinges did not squeak, they ground harshly against bent metal. I stopped abruptly in the doorway, my heavy boots freezing on the threshold. The cold evening wind howled aggressively through the shattered ground-level window, blowing loose paperwork across the chaotic, completely ransacked room. The deep, agonizing sorrow of the morning's confession to Eleanor vanished entirely, replaced instantly by a dark, all-consuming fury that burned the back of my throat. Julian Vance's men had finally crossed the line. The violence had officially invaded my sanctuary. I stepped carefully into the room, drawing the sleek steel revolver from my coat pocket. The familiar weight of the weapon offered exactly zero comfort against the visual devastation. The glass panes of the antique bookcases were entirely pulverized. Hundreds of thick, leather-bound volumes lay scattered and torn across the scarred wooden floor, their pages ripped indiscriminately from the bindings. The thick oriental rug was violently overturned, pushed into a messy pile in the corner. My eyes darted toward the center of the room. The solid oak desk, a massive heirloom that had belonged to my grandfather, was completely demolished. The heavy drawers had been ripped completely off their metal tracks and smashed into splinters. Old tax returns, deep personal files, and decades of mundane family history fluttered pointlessly in the freezing wind. I rubbed my jaw, my fingers dragging harshly against the stiff stubble. The friction burned my skin, matching the boiling pressure expanding dangerously inside my ribs. I kicked a shattered piece of oak out of my path. The heavy wood skidded noisily across the floor. They had come explicitly for the ledger. The foolish hope that my secret crypt had bought me enough time was a pathetic illusion. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they possessed the brute force to tear my life down until they found it. The piercing ache of my absolute violation radiated down to my fingertips. I walked slowly toward the back of the room, my boots crunching heavily over the crushed glass. The floorboards near my desk were completely ripped up. Jagged splinters of pine pointed sharply into the air like punji sticks. The secret compartment where the safe used to rest was utterly exposed. The heavy steel safe itself sat completely open, the thick door hanging lazily on its hinges. They had used an industrial plasma torch. The edges of the metal were scorched black and still radiated a faint, menacing heat. The sharp smell of burnt steel confirmed the timeline. They had been here less than an hour ago. The paralyzing fear that usually accompanied an invasion was entirely absent. Emotion dory absent. The hollow betrayal of Julian's actions meant nothing to me anymore. I knelt beside the scorched safe, resting my gloved hand near the warm metal. A deep primal rage twisted sharply in my gut. They had searched the safe, found it completely empty, and resorted to tearing the entire study apart in a blind panic. Maybe they were still watching the perimeter. Perhaps they planned to return when the sun completely set. Something about the sheer level of destruction suggested panic rather than precision. Julian's polished exterior was finally cracking. His perfectly tailored thugs had made a desperate, ugly mess. The chaotic energy in the room felt volatile, like a live grenade with the pin already pulled. I stood back up, checking the cylinder of the revolver. 6 brass cartridges gleamed back at me. The mechanical clicks sounded sharp and decisive against the howling wind. The immense burden of my secrets had almost crushed me this morning, leaving me completely vulnerable before Eleanor's disgust. But standing here, surrounded by the shattered remnants of my peaceful retirement, the vulnerability immediately crystallized into an icy, impenetrable armor. Julian had arrogantly assumed I would cower. He believed the threat of violence would inevitably force my absolute surrender. He was incredibly wrong. I walked toward the shattered window, stepping over the ruined books. I peered out into the dark, overgrown shrubbery of the backyard. The pale moonlight illuminated the silent shadows, but nothing moved. I gripped the wooden frame of the broken window, the sharp splinters digging directly into my leather glove. The silent siege had escalated into an open war, accelerating far past the bounds of simple blackmail. Unveiling the truth to Eleanor had triggered the final explosive confrontation. I accepted the dark reality with disturbing ease. There was no going back to the quiet life. The guilt of my past crimes was irrelevant now. The pendulum had swung violently, and absolute retribution was the only remaining path. I turned away from the window, surveying the absolute wreckage of my private sanctuary. The profound grief of watching my family legacy splinter into pieces faded completely into the background. The intense rage possessed me wholly, functioning as a cold, terrifyingly sharp blade. I walked over to the ruined desk and picked up a torn photograph of Eleanor, carefully brushing the dust from her smiling face. I slipped the picture safely into my inner chest pocket. Emotion bedeplays. The undeniable truth settled deeply in my bones. I was going to hunt Julian Vance down. I was going to systematically rip apart his beautiful, sterile penthouse, just as his men had destroyed my home. The deafening roar of the wind outside served as the perfect soundtrack to my descending madness. I stared into the dark room, watching the shadows dance across the torn paper. I glanced at the floor, taking in the full color of the destruction. The shattered glass produced a sharp sound, a loud clatter echoing and bouncing off the walls like a buzzing hum. I refused to call the local department. The sheer irony of an old corrupt detective reporting a break-in was a sickening joke. Furthermore, involving official channels would only expose Eleanor to the brutal crossfire. The profound despair of fighting alone had evaporated, leaving a man who truly had nothing left to lose. I secured the heavy revolver in its rough leather holster. The smooth leather squeaked softly against my belt. A sour, bitter taste coated the back of my mouth, a salty flavor of adrenaline. I pressed my hand against the cold, damp stone wall. Tracing the rough texture, I felt a sudden warmth in my face. Julian's arrogance had finally blinded him. He had mistakenly assumed a wounded dog would simply retreat to the shadows to quietly expire. He had entirely forgotten the fundamental rule of the old streets we used to run together: never trap a predator in its own den without guaranteeing the lethal blow. I stepped out of the study, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. The latch clicked softly, a pathetic sound considering the lock was entirely useless. The dark hallway stretched before me like a wide, hungry cavern. The time for reactive defense was permanently over. Looking down the long corridor, I coldly calculated the exact logistics of the assault. He wanted to bleed my family dry. He wanted to destroy everything I fought to silently protect. I knew exactly where he slept, and I knew the exact layout of his security network. I smelled the heavy scent of burning wood again. A sudden whiff of stale sweat hit me. Was there even a remote possibility he would survive the night? The pure, unadulterated fury radiating from my chest promised absolute carnage. I checked the heavy revolver resting against my side one final time, confirming the deadly weight. There was going to be an ocean of blood tonight, and absolutely nothing was going to stop me from ensuring it was his. Emotion. The harsh, bright flash of the digital camera briefly illuminated the suffocating darkness of the crypt, burning a bright afterimage into my tired retinas. I knelt on the cold, damp stone floor, the heavy leather ledger resting open atop a weathered sarcophagus. The pale glow of the flashlight provided just enough light for the lens to focus on the brittle, yellowed pages. A sharp scent of stagnant water and decaying earth filled my lungs. I clicked the shutter again. The mechanical sound echoed loudly through the long, empty stone corridor, a sharp clatter that bounced off the curved ceiling like a cracking whip. I stared intently at the small digital screen on the back of the camera, checking the smooth texture and clarity of the exposure. Every single illicit transaction, every massive bribe, and every destroyed life connected to Julian Vance was perfectly captured in high resolution. The agonizing sorrow I had always associated with this book was entirely gone. The deep, hollow shame of protecting this criminal artifact had evaporated. The profound grief over my compromised badge no longer mattered. As I turned to page 64, exposing the specific wire transfers that funded the mayor's first campaign, a bitter, sour taste coated my tongue. The taste of pure, calculated revenge. I had spent the last 10 years playing the victim, passively trying to survive in the shadow of a monster. I had believed that hiding the truth was a noble sacrifice. I realized now, pushing my thumb against the rough edge of the thick paper, that passive defense was just a coward's way of avoiding the necessary violence. The paralyzing fear of Julian's vast resources had completely blinded me. The utter betrayal of Eleanor's trust this morning had broken the final seal on my conscience. If Julian wanted to destroy my daughter using fabricated evidence, I would destroy his entire empire using the undeniable, documented truth. I watched the delicate color of the ink shift under the bright beam. I took another photo. The bright flash washed out the dark shadows pooled in the alcoves. I felt deeply empowered, yet simultaneously tainted by the exact blackmail tactics I had always vehemently despised. I was actively adopting the methods of my enemy. Perhaps I was crossing a psychological Rubicon. Maybe the ghost of my great-grandfather, buried right beneath me, would applaud the ruthless pragmatism. Something about the cold, heavy grip of my revolver resting against my hip offered a dark, satisfying confirmation. I turned the heavy page. Frame. Focus. Flash. The rhythmic, repetitive motion became a terrible, almost hypnotic ritual. The raw ache in my knees from kneeling on the unforgiving stone faded into the background. My hands, which had trembled violently just a few hours ago, were now completely steady. I was meticulously building a massive, lethal bomb entirely composed of Julian's own sins. Once I uploaded these high-resolution images to the secure server I had maintained for offshore evidence since 1999, physical proximity to the actual ledger wouldn't matter anymore. If anything happened to me, or if Julian successfully breached the manor, a dead man's switch would automatically forward the encrypted files to the FBI, the IRS, and every major news outlet in the state. I smelled the faint odor of gun oil wafting from my heavy coat, blending strangely with the heavy scent of the damp crypt. It was the scent of absolute war. I pressed the shutter button for the last page. The sudden silence that followed the final click was incredibly heavy. The digital counter on the screen displayed 112 completely damning images. I closed the thick leather book, the aged binding producing a loud, strained creak. I ran my fingertips over the rough, worn cover, feeling the subtle indentations of the embossed gold lettering. I had successfully weaponized the Pendleton legacy. The profound despair of my past had officially transformed into a terrifyingly sharp tactical advantage. I shoved the ledger back into the thick, waterproof canvas bag, securing the heavy brass zippers. I pushed the heavy granite block aside with a straining grunt, placing the bag back into the dark, rectangular cavity in the stone wall, and pulled the block flush again. I stood up, my joints popping loudly. The weak yellow light from the flashlight barely penetrated the oppressive darkness stretching toward the rusted iron door. The immense relief of shifting from a defensive posture to an aggressive strike surged through my bloodstream. The crippling vulnerability was dead, emotion. I was no longer simply trying to survive the night. I was preparing to actively dismantle Julian Vance's entire existence. I walked slowly back toward the stone staircase, my heavy boots splashing through the shallow puddles of groundwater. I heard the steady, agonizing drip, drip, drip echoing through the cavern. The cold draft swept over my face, carrying a faint whiff of ozone from the outside storm. I checked the digital camera again, ensuring the memory card was securely locked in its plastic housing. The digital display glowed with a faint, bright blue light, illuminating my calloused hands. I tightened my grip on the heavy steel revolver. The impending confrontation was entirely unavoidable. He expected me to beg for Eleanor's career. He expected absolute submission. Was he prepared for the horrifying alternative? The dark, churning rage inside my chest promised a level of violence that words could not describe. But as I reached the heavy iron door leading back to the basement, a chilling realization hit me. I possessed the absolute power to ruin him, but would it be enough to keep her from ending up dead? The climb up the rough stone stairs felt distinctly different this time. The oppressive weight that usually accompanied my descent into the crypt had been completely lifted, replaced instead by a cold, calculating energy that vibrated beneath my skin. I listened closely to the erratic hum of the old wiring struggling to power the basement lights above me. The quiet, persistent buzz cut through the absolute silence of the house. I touched the cold metal rail, the smooth texture slick with intense condensation. The sweet metallic fragrance of the pending rainstorm was incredibly faint, but still detectable through the heavy ancient oak doors of the upper levels. I paused on the final step, glancing back toward the heavy shadows I had just abandoned. The dark abyss seemed to watch me, a silent witness to my total transformation. The intense, deep-seated guilt of keeping those secrets was officially erased. I had fully embraced the dark legacy required to enact my brand of justice. I pushed the rusted iron door open. The metallic clatter resonated loudly, signaling the end of an era. The sharp, bitter scent of burning pine filled the crowded courtroom. I stared straight ahead, watching the heavy oak gavel strike the sound block, effectively tearing my family's legacy into worthless pieces. The loud clatter produced a sickening echo, bouncing harshly against the tall marble walls like a gunshot. The judge's booming voice delivered the final sentence, authorizing the complete asset seizure of the Vance estate. I gripped the smooth, lacquered defense table. The texture felt cold against my damp palms. My young father sat exactly 3 feet to my right, completely broken. The profound despair radiating from his slumping shoulders was a physical weight I could almost touch. I glanced across the center aisle. Arthur Pendelton's father, Chief Inspector Thomas Pendleton, stood near the prosecutor's bench. His custom-tailored suit looked immaculate, completely unbothered by the heavy, humid air of the room. He wore a quiet, arrogant smirk, completely satisfied with orchestrating my father's downfall through a web of fabricated evidence and strategic perjury. His dark eyes met mine for a fleeting second. The sheer arrogance in his gaze communicated exactly what he thought of the Vance name. We were dirt beneath his expensive shoes. The hollow cavity in my chest expanded rapidly. The deep, agonizing sorrow of watching a proud man crumble completely paralyzed me. A sour, metallic taste coated my tongue, a raw flavor of utter helplessness. I felt a sudden rush of warmth flush across my face as my father began to silently weep. The quiet, muffled sound of his sobbing was the most horrifying noise I had ever heard. The court officers moved in quickly, their heavy boots producing a heavy thud against the hardwood floor. They grabbed his arms roughly, securing the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. I stood perfectly still, watching the bright glow of the exit sign above the heavy double doors. The vibrant red color burned an afterimage into my vision. The quiet hum of the ancient air conditioning unit struggled to filter the terrible stench of old sweat and despair that permeated the gallery. Emotion. 20 years of hard work, erased by a single corrupt detective looking for a quick promotion. The utter betrayal of the justice system was absolute. The law was simply a weapon wielded by those who already possessed power. Maybe naive victims cried out for fairness. Perhaps a weaker man would simply surrender quietly and fade into poverty. Something about the way Thomas Pendleton adjusted his gold tie clip violently shifted my perspective. The crippling fear and deep-seated guilt for failing to protect my father instantly evaporated. The intense bitterness flooded my veins, acting as a terrifyingly effective anesthetic. The victim mentality was completely dead. I was 35 years old, stripping away every moral restraint I had ever been taught. I realized, with absolute clarity, that surviving in this world required becoming exactly like the monsters surrounding me. I stepped away from the defense table into the wide, dark hallway. The shadows clung heavily to the limestone architecture. I heard the sharp creak of the courtroom doors opening behind me. Thomas Pendleton walked out, laughing loudly with the prosecuting attorney. A sudden whiff of stale cigar smoke trailed behind him. I observed his relaxed posture, the precise manner in which he carried his heavy, leather-bound briefcase. He believed the Vance name was permanently dismantled. He believed the threat was entirely neutralized. I traced the rough texture of the decorative stone pillar beside me. The friction scraped against my skin, grounding me in the immediate reality. The profound grief was completely overshadowed by a dark, calculated rage. I was going to ruin his lineage. I was going to manipulate the system his family held sacred, infesting the corrupt department from the inside out until I controlled it completely. I would smile at his son, pretend to be a close friend, and systematically orchestrate their complete destruction. The heavy rain outside suddenly intensified, battering against the tall glass windows with a frantic buzz. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp, cold scent of the approaching storm. The transition from a broken son to a ruthless predator was complete. I checked the gold cufflinks resting against my wrists to steady my hands. The polished surface caught the dim corridor light. I swore a silent, irrevocable oath in that extremely dark corridor. The Pendleton family was going to pay. Was there any doubt I possessed the patience to execute a 20-year plan? The sheer, unadulterated bitterness inside me guaranteed a massive blood debt. They had aggressively started a war without ensuring the lethal blow was struck, and the only remaining certainty was that I was going to leave absolutely nothing behind. The courthouse lobby felt like a massive tomb as I methodically descended the grand marble staircase. I listened to the sharp clicking of my own dress shoes echoing off the polished stone, an aggressive rhythm marking the start of my new existence. I refused to look back at the heavy wooden doors where my father's fate had been mercilessly sealed. The agonizing shame that had briefly threatened to crush me was rapidly replaced by a hyper-focused clarity. I watched the rain violently wash over the large glass entrance doors, blurring the vibrant colors of the city streets outside into dull, chaotic streaks. I pushed through the heavy turnstiles, the cold metal biting sharply into my hip. The sudden gust of freezing wind hit my face, carrying the bitter scent of wet concrete and exhaust fumes. I pressed my coat tightly against my chest, the rough wool offering minimal protection against the severe chill. I felt absolutely nothing. The immense sorrow had been entirely consumed by the roaring fire of my newfound malice. Thomas Pendleton had inadvertently created his own executioner. I stepped directly into the pouring rain, letting the icy water soak through my tailored suit. The physical discomfort was entirely negligible compared to the hollow ache he had permanently carved into my soul. The long, terrifying hunt had officially begun. I had learned the rules of their corrupt game today, but when I finally returned to play, the game would end on my exact terms. Emotion. The sharp clatter of the rotary phone dial spinning back into place violently echoed through the quiet destruction of my home. I stood amidst the utter ruin of the study, gripping the heavy black receiver so tightly my knuckles turned a bruised shade of white. The rough texture of the plastic dug into my calloused palm. A stale odor of pulverized dry wall and burning wood lingered heavily in the cold morning air. I stared down at the polished wooden surface of my grandfather's demolished desk, taking in the full color of the horrific wreckage. The profound grief over losing my family sanctuary had evaporated completely, immediately replaced by a devastating, surgical focus. The paralyzing fear that had dictated my life for the past decade was officially dead. The telephone line hummed with a low, static buzz for 3 long seconds. I watched the dark shadows stretch across the shattered glass littering the floor. Arthur. Julian's voice came through the crackling earpiece, smooth and completely undisturbed. The deep, rich sound of his greeting carried the disgusting flavor of arrogant victory. I genuinely did not expect you to call this early. Has the cold reality of your situation finally set in? A bitter metallic taste coated my tongue. The sheer audacity of his relaxed tone ignited a fresh surge of rage in my chest. I pressed my free hand against the damp brick wall to steady myself. The cold stone bit sharply into my skin. I took a slow, measured breath, forcing my heart rate into a calm, steady rhythm. The time for desperate pleas was entirely over. Perhaps I had played the victim too well. Maybe he genuinely believed the ransacked state of my manor had successfully broken my spirit. The study is completely destroyed, Julian, I said, my voice dropping into a low, gravelly cadence. Your men made a spectacular mess. They missed the safe beneath the floorboards, but the message was extremely clear. A regrettable necessity, Julian replied quickly, the false warmth dripping from every syllable. I merely wanted to emphasize the urgency of our transaction. Where is the ledger, Arthur? Time is slipping away. I glanced out the shattered window. The pale morning light was rapidly growing stronger, revealing the twisted, dark branches of old oak trees swaying aggressively in the wind. The hollow ache of my past betrayals provided a terrifying clarity. I was actively orchestrating my own deadly ambush. And third a mission hudes. Tense I have it, I lied, the words tasting perfectly sweet as they rolled smoothly off my tongue. The actual ledger was resting securely in the crypt, already meticulously photographed and verified, but the bait had to look incredibly authentic. I retrieved it from the secondary vault. It sits on my kitchen island. A brief, delicious silence hung on the line. The quiet sound of Julian exhaling softly resonated loudly. The predator had caught the scent. Excellent, Julian said, his voice dropping slightly. I will send a team to collect it within the hour. No. I gripped the receiver tighter, the hard plastic biting sharply into my skin. You come here, Julian, alone. You completely destroyed my home. You explicitly threatened my daughter's career. If you want the physical proof of your empire's foundation turned to ash, you will walk through my front door and take it from my hands. If I even see a completely unknown car pull into the gravel driveway, I drop the entire book directly into the wood chipper. The line fell into a harsh silence. I rubbed my jaw, feeling the stiff, rough stubble scraping against my fingers. I could almost smell the stench of his sudden hesitation. I was challenging the core of his power. Something about the direct confrontation always unsettled a man accustomed to hiding strictly behind paid muscle. You are making demands, Arthur. Julian chuckled quietly, a dry, humorless sound. That is an extraordinarily dangerous game. What guarantee do I have that you are not simply setting a violent trap? I am completely alone, I stated flatly, staring directly into the dark hallway leading toward the kitchen. I sent Eleanor completely away. The police are entirely uninvolved, and what guarantee do I possess that you will not simply murder me the second I hand over the book? My word, old friend, Julian whispered smoothly. The profound betrayal of those specific words stung momentarily, bringing a bitter laugh strictly to the edge of my lips. Be here at exactly 8 o'clock tonight, Julian. Bring the financial clearance documents for Eleanor's precinct. We trade. The past dies tonight. I slammed the heavy receiver down onto the black cradle before he could offer another sweet, poisonous lie. The solid plastic clicked violently into place. The sudden silence in the study was absolutely deafening. I felt a tremendous rush of adrenaline flush completely through my veins, bringing a sudden, intense warmth to my chest. I turned away from the desk, my heavy boots crushing the glass fragments into fine white powder. The strategy was irrevocably locked into motion. He would arrive tonight, arrogantly believing he held the absolute upper hand. He would step directly into the lion's den. I walked across the ruined room, retrieving the cold steel revolver resting atop a pile of torn case files. The heavy metallic weight felt completely natural in my grip. The sorrow of my corrupted legacy was finally transforming directly into an unyielding weapon. I checked the heavy brass cartridges methodically, the sharp metallic clicks echoing rapidly like the ticking of an internal execution clock. Every action, every specific calculated movement felt entirely necessary. Was I actively prepared to embrace this level of violence? The crushing guilt of the past simply faded into obscurity. I watched the early morning light bleed fully across the hardwood floor, completely illuminating a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The trap was set, but as I loaded the final bullet into the cylinder, a singular terrifying question remained. Who would actually walk out of the manor alive? The hours stretching between the morning sun and the evening shadows crawled by with an agonizingly slow pace. I meticulously cleared a long, unimpeded path through the scattered debris in the hallway, anticipating the precise sightlines required for tonight's confrontation. The quiet creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet served as my only company. I cleaned the cold steel barrel of the revolver twice, ensuring the mechanism was utterly flawless. The sharp, mechanical hum of my own internal focus completely drowned out the erratic buzzing of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. I tasted the bitter ash of the destroyed room every single time I took a deep breath. Julian possessed an incredible arrogance, an undeniable belief in his own invincibility. He would absolutely come alone. His massive ego simply wouldn't permit him to show weakness by bringing armed guards to face an aging retired detective. The deep, heavy ache in my lower back practically vanished, fully suppressed by the tactical necessity of survival. I stared at the dark oak front door, visually measuring the exact distance to the kitchen island. I had weaponized my entire home. Everything was perfectly aligned for maximum lethality. I smelled the heavy aroma of old rain still clinging to the exterior walls, a dark, atmospheric prelude to the violent storm I was about to deliberately invite inside. The profound shame of my past inaction was officially dead. I was completely ready. Emotion, the sharp, synthetic ping of my laptop, receiving a new email, cut through the heavy, stagnant air of my small apartment. I stood motionless in the narrow hallway, the cold water from my dripping umbrella pooling slowly onto the cheap linoleum floor. I was entirely exhausted. The agonizing betrayal of my father's morning confession still burned aggressively in the center of my chest. I aggressively tossed my heavy wool coat over the back of the sofa, the damp fabric slapping loudly against the worn leather. The bitter taste of old coffee lingered on my tongue, but the true sour flavor in my mouth was the terrible realization that my entire career was built on a foundation of massive corruption. I walked toward the small wooden desk pressed against the window. The heavy rain battered against the thin glass, a chaotic drumbeat that matched the intense, painful thumping behind my temples. My father was a criminal. He had deliberately covered up the cartel bribery ring. He had actively protected Julian Vance while innocent men went to federal prison. The profound grief of losing my idealized hero was absolutely devastating. I dragged my hands through my wet hair. The rough friction against my scalp did nothing to alleviate the brutal pressure. I sat down in the squeaky metal chair, staring blankly at the bright glow of the laptop screen. A single unread email sat in my personal inbox. The sender address was encrypted, an archaic string of numbers and letters my father typically reserved for his most paranoid off-book communications. The subject line was totally blank. I gripped the edges of the desk, my fingernails digging fiercely into the smooth wood until a sharp ache shot up my wrists. It was exactly 7:55 p.m. Why was he sending me an encrypted file now? I clicked the heavy trackpad. The metallic click echoed sharply in the silent room. A massive compressed zip folder appeared, containing over 100 high-resolution image files. Below the attachment rested a dense block of text, typed meticulously in his familiar, completely measured cadence. I leaned closer to the bright display, the harsh blue light washing out the dark shadows beneath my tired eyes. Eleanor, the letter began. The simple name immediately brought a heavy, suffocating tightness to my throat. If you are receiving this message, the automated server has triggered a dead man's switch. It means I am either completely incapacitated or I did not survive the night. The air completely vanished from my lungs. A terrifying, icy chill instantly rippled down my spine, freezing my blood. The sheer horror of those specific words shattered the thick wall of anger I had constructed since this morning. The hollow despair expanded rapidly, consuming my entire chest. Emotion. I pressed my trembling hand against my mouth to stifle a sudden, sharp gasp. I am so deeply sorry for the lies, the digital text continued, the cold pixels failing to mask the immense sorrow behind his words. You were incredibly right to be disgusted with me. I compromised exactly everything the badge stood for. I betrayed the department, but I never once betrayed you. I scrolled down, my vision blurring dramatically as hot tears pooled in my eyes. I blinked rapidly, the salty water spilling down my cold cheeks. I tasted the bitter salt on my lips. Julian Vance implicitly threatened to murder you and your mother if I did not bury the ledger 20 years ago. He possessed the exact resources to execute that threat flawlessly. I traded my honor for your absolute safety. It was the only tangible currency I had left. The deep, heavy guilt of that singular decision has haunted every single day of my life. But looking at the brilliant, uncompromising detective you became, I would make the exact same horrific bargain again. My hands shook violently against the keyboard. The profound heartbreak ripped through old wounds I never knew existed. The terrible, heavy anger I felt toward him instantly dissolved into a pure, agonizing ache. He hadn't aligned with a monster out of greed. He had submitted entirely out of desperate, unconditional love. He had carried the absolute shame of a dirty cop so I could live to wear a clean badge. Perhaps I was an incredibly naive fool to believe the world operated on simple black and white justice. Maybe genuine salvation always demanded a bloody sacrifice. I violently clicked the attached folder. The fast download progressed rapidly, unzipping the files directly onto my desktop. I opened the first image. It was a high-resolution photograph of the very ledger I had been desperately hunting. The yellowed pages, the specific dates, the exact transaction numbers linking Julian Vance's massive legitimate empire directly to the brutal cartel operations. The undeniable, meticulously documented truth glowed brightly on my small screen. He had given me exactly what I needed to dismantle Julian completely. The attached files contain the full Pendelton ledger, his letter concluded. Every single piece of evidence required to completely ruin Julian Vance is right here. I am meeting him at the manor tonight to end this permanently. They will come for these files, Eleanor. Do not waste them. Do not let my failures drag you down. Expose him to the world. I love you, and I am so incredibly proud of you. Goodbye. I pushed the metal chair back so violently it crashed loudly to the floor. The metallic clatter resonated through the tiny apartment like a sudden explosion. I scrambled toward the sofa, grabbing my heavy wool coat and my police-issued radio. The intense, deep-rooted fear for his life acted like pure adrenaline, flushing the exhaustion completely from my system. My father was walking directly into a suicide mission at the manor. He was offering himself proudly as the final sacrifice to protect me. I checked my wristwatch. It was exactly 8:12 p.m. The confrontation had already begun. The overwhelming panic tightened around my ribcage, tighter than a steel vice. I slammed the apartment door shut, sprinting heavily down the narrow hallway. The loud thuds of my boots echoed sharply against the plastered walls. I heard the frantic, chaotic buzz of my own pulse pounding directly in my ears. I possessed the absolute truth now. The dark, horrific legacy of our family was fully exposed. But as I burst out into the freezing, torrential rain and threw myself into my unmarked squad car, the singular, terrifying reality fully set in. Was I already entirely too late? The heavy rain washed over the windshield, completely obscuring the dark road ahead. There was a bloody war happening right now, and absolutely nothing was going to stop me from joining it. The engine roared violently to life as I twisted the ignition key, drowning out the drumming rain. I threw the gearshift into drive, the tires spinning wildly against the wet asphalt before catching traction. The bright headlights sliced through the descending darkness, illuminating the slick city streets. My knuckles were bone white as I gripped the steering wheel, the textured leather digging painfully into my skin. I did not activate the siren. Giving Julian Vance advanced warning was a tactical error. The agonizing heartbreak of my father's confession echoed relentlessly in my mind. He traded his moral foundation to buy my future. I navigated the sharp turns toward the manor district. The scent of damp wool from my soaked coat filled the cabin. I touched the heavy steel of my service weapon securely resting in its holster. Julian had actively destroyed my family's reputation and was currently attempting to murder my parent. But as the dark silhouette of the manor finally appeared through the heavy rain, a terrifying question gripped me. Was I already too late? Emotion. The profound grief evaporated. I was entirely ready for the blood that would inevitably spill. The bright orange flames danced wildly in the large stone fireplace, casting erratic shadows across the scattered debris of my study. I stood perfectly still near the roaring hearth, watching the intense glow illuminate the ruined room. The rich color of the fire provided a stark contrast to the oppressive storm raging aggressively outside. I gripped the thick leather ledger tightly, its rough texture scraping against my wool sweater. The profound grief that had haunted my entire adult life was gone, replaced by a pure, intoxicating sense of absolute triumph. The heavy oak front door groaned loudly, a sharp creak slicing sharply through the steady hum of the rain. The sound of polished shoes clicking methodically against the hardwood floor announced his arrival. Julian Vance stepped onto the torn carpet, looking incredibly immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit that repelled the damp weather. He carried a silver briefcase, exuding the relaxed confidence of a predator. "Punctual as always, Julian," I said, keeping my voice level. Julian smiled, a cold grimace that did nothing to warm his dark eyes. He adjusted his suit jacket. "A precise schedule is the strict foundation of any successful empire, Arthur. You look terrible. I suppose the immense stress of hiding your father's legacy has finally caught up with you." The bitter tone rolled off me. I tasted the sweet flavor of approaching victory on my tongue. The crippling fear he usually inspired had completely evaporated. I pressed my thumb against the thick brass clasp of the ledger. The cold metal bit sharply into my skin. "I am fine," I replied softly, stepping closer to the intense heat of the fire. I deliberately slumped my shoulders, physically playing the submissive victim one last time. "You brought the clearance documents for Eleanor's precinct." Julian chuckled, a dry sound that echoed in the large room. He set the silver briefcase gently on the side table. "I always honor my specific agreements, Arthur. Eleanor's career is secure. Now hand over the physical book. Let us end this tedious nightmare." I stared directly at him, carefully observing the slight twitch near his left eye. He raised his right hand, systematically toying with his expensive gold cufflinks. It was his classic physical tell for suppressed anxiety. Something about standing in the ruined manor, completely alone, genuinely unsettled him. "You believed you could control the Pendleton legacy forever," I whispered, the quiet sound barely cutting through the loud crackle of the burning logs. The hollow ache of submitting to his blackmail vanished. I gripped the heavy ledger tightly. "You believed holding my daughter hostage would force my total surrender indefinitely." Julian stopped toying with the gold cufflink. His smooth expression hardened instantly, adopting the ruthless mask of the terrifying cartel boss he truly was. "Arthur," he warned, his voice plunging into an icy baritone. "Do not attempt anything foolish. Deliver the item." I smiled. The intense rush of adrenaline completely flooded my veins. The profound triumph was a roaring fire inside my chest. "I am delivering exactly what you deserve," I stated clearly. I raised the heavy leather ledger high and forcefully threw it directly into the roaring flames. The heavy book hit the burning logs with an aggressive clatter. The bright fire instantly curled hungrily around the brittle pages. A sharp hiss erupted as the ancient ink began to boil. The dark, intoxicating scent of burning paper and melting glue filled the room, a thick aroma of absolute destruction. Julian froze. His jaw dropped slightly, genuine shock momentarily fracturing his polished exterior. He lunged forward instinctively, his polished shoes slipping against the glass debris, but the intense heat violently pushed him back. "Are you completely insane?" Julian roared, his smooth voice cracking with sudden panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the burning ruins of his leverage. "You just destroyed the foundation of your family's legacy. You burned the only tangible proof." "I destroyed the physical anchor you used to drown me," I corrected calmly, stepping backward. I watched the golden flames consume the thick leather cover, the bright color shifting into a blackened husk. The sheer relief was intoxicating. "You assumed the original document was my only leverage. You forgot I am a meticulously trained detective, Julian. I photographed every single page in high resolution." The color rapidly drained from Julian's face. He stared at me, his dark eyes wide with terrifying realization. The loud buzz of the heavy rain outside seemed to amplify. He frantically touched his gold cufflink again. "You are bluffing," Julian snapped aggressively. "Emotion. You lack the absolute nerve to expose your own family's deep corruption." "The encrypted files were scheduled to forward to the FBI and the IRS tonight," I stated coldly. I felt the comforting, rough grip of the revolver tucked securely against my hip, but I did not draw it. The intellectual checkmate was infinitely more satisfying. However, I preemptively triggered the absolute release 20 minutes ago. Eleanor already has a perfectly pristine copy. The federal authorities are actively mobilizing right now. Your massive legitimate empire is totally dead. A profound silence descended, broken only by the steady crackle of the burning ledger. The intense bitterness that had defined Julian's vendetta was completely shattered. He had spent his adult life aggressively building a corrupt kingdom, only to watch it literally turn to worthless ash before his eyes. The absolute sorrow of his impending downfall was painted vividly across his pale features. He had entirely miscalculated the limits of a desperate father. The terrifying family curse was officially broken. I possessed nothing left to hide. Julian stared into the fireplace, watching the last recognizable page of the ledger incinerate entirely. The glowing red embers pulsed rhythmically, his shoulders slumped heavily, the immaculate tailoring of his suit looking extremely pathetic. But as he reached a trembling hand toward the heavy oak door to escape into the heavy storm, a sudden, blinding flash of red and blue light violently illuminated the front windows, followed instantly by the deafening wail of approaching sirens. The authorities had arrived entirely too fast. Was there absolutely any chance he would surrender without a bloodbath? The blinding red and blue lights violently strobed across the ruined walls of the study, painting the destroyed room in chaotic flashes of color. I listened intently as the heavy thud of combat boots hit the wooden porch outside. The sharp mechanical clack of assault rifles being racked echoed loudly. The intense fear had entirely vacated my body. I walked slowly toward the heavy oak door, my heavy boots crunching loudly over the shattered glass. The cold draft whipping through the broken windows brought the sharp scent of ozone. I touched the heavy steel handle of the door, the smooth metal slick with condensation. Julian stood perfectly still, completely trapped. His empire was officially dead. The terrible cycle of vengeance initiated by our fathers was ending tonight. I felt the immense weight of the past fully lift from my shoulders. The crushing guilt was gone, leaving absolute clarity of redemption. Wu-on-say. But as the door violently swung open to reveal the armed tactical team rushing into the foyer, my heart suddenly seized in terror. Eleanor was standing directly behind the heavily armed units, aiming her weapon straight at my chest. The blinding red and blue lights violently strobed across the ruined walls of the study, painting the destroyed room in chaotic flashes of color. I stared perfectly still, the rough texture of the heavy oak door digging into my shoulder. The intense fear had completely vacated my body. I watched Eleanor step into the dim light of the foyer, her police-issued sidearm aimed squarely at my chest. The bright glow from the tactical flashlights behind her cast long, intimidating shadows across the damp hardwood floor. "Drop the weapon," Eleanor commanded rapidly, her voice echoing sharply against the stone fireplace. She used a sharp, precise hand gesture to direct the tactical team moving in behind her. The intense focus etched across her damp face revealed exactly how terrified she genuinely was. I slowly lowered the heavy steel revolver. The loud clatter of the cold metal hitting the scarred wooden surface of the hallway table resonated loudly over the steady hum of the rain. I raised both my hands, my calloused fingers trembling slightly in the cool air. The crushing guilt of 20 incredibly long years officially dissolved. The sheer relief of seeing her entirely safe, absolutely untouched by Julian's ruthless mercenaries, washed over me like a warm, cleansing wave. 3 heavily armored officers bypassed me entirely, their combat boots crunching loudly over the shattered glass. I heard the sharp, mechanical clack of handcuffs snapping shut behind me. Julian Vance offered absolutely no physical resistance. The arrogant predator had fully realized his immense empire was totally dead. "Julian Vance, you are under arrest," a gruff voice declared, reading the specific charges loudly over the chaotic buzz of the police radios. The sweet, satisfying flavor of absolute justice finally coated my tongue, rapidly chasing away the bitter, sour taste of my past cowardice. Eleanor lowered her weapon, aggressively shoving it back into her hip holster. She practically sprinted across the ruined foyer, completely ignoring the chaotic scene unfolding directly in her periphery. She threw her arms heavily around my neck, pressing her damp cheek against my rough wool sweater. I closed my eyes tightly, wrapping my arms tightly around her trembling shoulders. She smelled strongly of wet pavement and sharp ozone. "You incredibly stupid, reckless old man," Eleanor whispered rapidly, her voice cracking painfully. The tense muscles in her back shuddered violently against my hands. "I am fine, Elle," I replied quietly, resting my chin against the top of her wet hair. The profound grief that had permanently anchored my soul was completely gone. The deep, agonizing sorrow of betraying my badge was forcefully pushed aside by the pure, terrifying joy of successfully preserving her life. "I am completely fine." I glanced over her shoulder, watching two armed officers physically drag Julian out the massive front door. He did not look back. The dark, intoxicating scent of the burning ledger still drifted heavily from the study, a raw aroma of our mutual destruction. Eleanor stepped back, gripping my forearms forcefully. The damp fabric of my sleeves bunched under her sharp fingers. She stared directly into my eyes, searching the deep wrinkles for any hidden wounds. "The encrypted files you sent, they were absolutely devastating. Interpol is already executing raid warrants on his offshore accounts. The federal prosecutors have enough physical evidence to bury him in a concrete tomb for 3 consecutive lifetimes. The original book is currently ash in the fireplace," I stated softly, tracing the smooth texture of her waterproof jacket. "The physical anchor of our family curse is completely gone. Perhaps some of the older detectives will correctly suspect my long-term complicity. Maybe I will absolutely face severe legal consequences." "Let them try," Eleanor snapped fiercely, making a sharp, aggressive downward gesture with her right hand. The bright red and blue lights illuminated the unyielding determination burning in her gaze. "You sacrificed your entire reputation to protect my life. You deliberately exposed the largest corruption ring in the state. If they genuinely attempt to indict you, I will personally burn the prosecutor's office completely to the ground." I smiled, a genuine, albeit exhausted expression that barely disturbed the heavy ache in my lower jaw. The deep despair I had carried was an old ghost fading perfectly into obscurity. I touched her cheek, feeling the warm, smooth skin. Everything I had aggressively suffered through was explicitly validated the absolute second I saw her standing there, fiercely defending her compromised father. "We need to formally process the scene," Eleanor said, her voice shifting back into a rapid, strictly professional cadence. She stepped away, carefully navigating the scattered debris near the archway. "The Internal Affairs Unit will obviously want a comprehensive, heavily detailed statement regarding the destroyed study." I nodded slowly, leaning back against the cold, damp stone wall. The immense physical exhaustion suddenly crashed into my nervous system with the subtle impact of a runaway freight train. The sharp pain in my knees returned aggressively. I listened to the steady, rhythmic sound of the heavy rain aggressively battering the broken windows. The dark storm outside was slowly beginning to break, revealing a faint, pale sliver of moonlight piercing the heavy clouds. The terrible cycle of vengeance initiated by our fathers was officially over. I was completely ready to rest. But as I watched Eleanor systematically direct the forensic technicians through the ruined manor, a quiet, terrifying question emerged from the newly discovered silence. What exactly happens next when the specific monster you spent 20 years hiding from is finally captured and the hunt is truly done? The immense exhaustion settled deeply into my bones as I slowly walked toward the front porch. I stepped carefully over the threshold, leaning heavily against the thick wooden pillar. I watched the chaotic scene unfolding in the gravel driveway. The bright red and blue lights painted the wet grass in vibrant, artificial colors. I listened to the loud, chaotic hum of the idling police cruisers, a sharp, mechanical rhythm that strangely offered a deep sense of comfort. The bitter, freezing wind whipped aggressively across my face, carrying the distinct, sharp scent of exhaust fumes and wet asphalt. I pulled my thick wool sweater tightly around my chest, savoring the rough texture against my skin. The crushing guilt that had heavily dictated my every agonizing decision was officially dead. The intense fear of Julian Vance no longer held any power. I glanced back through the heavy oak door, observing the bright, steady glow of the dying fire in the study. The actual physical burden of the Pendelton legacy was currently turning rapidly into a pile of worthless white ash. I touched the cold metal railing of the porch, the smooth surface slick with heavy condensation. The profound relief was an incredibly powerful narcotic, effectively numbing the sharp aches in my aging body. I took a deep, deliberate breath, allowing the incredibly cold night air to deeply fill my sore lungs. The incredible hunt was perfectly over. My family was finally safe. I was entirely ready for whatever consequences the bright morning would inevitably bring. The bright morning sunlight poured generously through the large, uncurtained windows, painting the completely empty living room in warm golden hues. I stood near the massive stone fireplace, watching the tiny dust motes dance slowly in the bright beams. The rich color of the freshly polished hardwood floors gleamed flawlessly. I traced my calloused thumb over the smooth texture of the remaining mahogany side table. A crisp, sweet scent of early spring aggressively drifted through the open double doors, completely overpowering the stale, damp odor that had explicitly defined this massive house for 20 incredibly long years. The intense grief that had heavily anchored my soul was officially dead. The crushing guilt was entirely gone. A deep, profound peace had finally settled comfortably into my tired bones. I glanced toward the grand foyer. The young real estate broker, a sharp man matching his immaculate navy suit, clicked his expensive pen methodically against his leather clipboard. The sharp sound echoed lightly against the high plaster ceiling, a pleasant clatter entirely devoid of the terrifying malice that had previously saturated these acoustic walls. "The wire transfer is fully complete, Mr. Pendleton," the broker said smoothly, offering a bright, professional smile. He raised his right hand slightly, carefully adjusting his silk tie. "The new owners are incredibly eager to begin the immediate renovations. They apparently plan to completely gut the basement level next week." I smiled, a genuine, completely relaxed expression that perfectly eased the tension in my jaw. "Let them dig," I replied softly, my voice maintaining a steady, measured cadence. "They will absolutely find nothing but wet dirt and old concrete. The past is entirely removed." "Excellent," he replied, taking 2 quick steps toward me. "I just need the physical keys and the transaction is officially concluded." I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat, my fingers wrapping firmly around the heavy brass ring. The cold metal bit sharply against my skin. These keys had painfully locked away my father's terrible corruption. They had secured the dark crypt where I had foolishly buried my own honor. I pulled the heavy ring out into the bright light. The brass visually glowed with a dull, weathered sheen. The agonizing shame tethered to this specific metal had finally evaporated. Emotion agony. I possessed absolutely no desire to ever hold them again. I pressed the heavy keys directly into the broker's open palm. The sharp jingle of the shifting metal sounded exactly like a cell door finally swinging completely open. "Congratulations on the successful sale, Arthur," a familiar voice called out warmly from the wide entryway. I turned around slowly. Eleanor walked into the bright foyer, the morning sunlight catching the vibrant red tones in her dark hair. She wore a casual leather jacket, her posture completely relaxed and absolutely unburdened. The dark shadows that usually hugged her sharp cheekbones were entirely absent. She smelled distinctly of fresh, dark roast coffee, a wonderful aroma that completely overrode any lingering stench of the manor's history. "You are precisely on time," I noted, carefully walking across the smooth floor to meet her. The persistent ache in my knees had wonderfully faded into a dull, manageable throb. Eleanor grinned, making a quick, sharp gesture toward the gravel driveway outside. "The moving truck completely finished unloading your boxes at the new city apartment an hour ago. You officially own less furniture than a college student. You possess absolutely nothing but a bed and a coffee maker. A simple life requires simple tools," I replied, lightly touching her shoulder. The rough texture of her leather jacket felt incredibly real and completely grounding. The profound relief of simply seeing her standing there, entirely safe and proudly wearing her clean badge, was an intoxicating flavor I could happily taste every single day. Julian Vance was currently sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell directly downtown, aggressively facing 72 distinct, undeniable charges of severe corruption, massive extortion, and attempted murder. The intricate, powerful empire he had violently built over 2 grueling decades was totally dead. The massive offshore accounts were completely frozen. The dark blackmail network was entirely burned. My aggressive confession to internal affairs regarding my passive complicity had certainly produced a severe reprimand and the immediate revocation of my pension, but the overwhelming physical evidence I actively provided had secured full federal immunity. The immense blood debt was thoroughly paid. I had successfully traded my miserable past for her bright future. "Are you completely ready to go?" Eleanor asked, her bright eyes scanning the empty room carefully before finally resting on me. "I am perfectly ready," I answered quietly. Emotioned. We walked out the heavy oak front doors together, stepping directly onto the wide wooden porch. A sudden gust of warm wind swept past us, rustling the thick green leaves of the ancient oak trees. The loud, chaotic buzz of the distant city traffic was a strangely comforting hum. We descended the stone steps, my heavy boots crunching softly against the loose gravel. I stopped briefly near her unmarked squad car, turning completely around to look at the massive manor one final time. The tall, imposing stone walls stood absolutely silent against the clear blue sky. The dark, terrifying predator that had aggressively consumed my family was finally dead. It was merely a hollow building now, entirely, completely empty of ghosts. I felt an incredible warmth spreading thoroughly across my chest. The bitter flavor of survival had elegantly transitioned into the sweet, satisfying taste of authentic freedom. But as Eleanor started the engine and I settled deeply into the passenger seat, gazing toward the vibrant skyline, a singular question gently echoed: was I finally brave enough to truly live? The smooth hum of the car engine provided a perfect rhythmic soundtrack as we slowly navigated away from the large iron gates of the estate. I stared thoughtfully through the clear glass window, watching the dense line of dark evergreen trees rapidly disappear behind us. The intense, bright color of the morning sky offered a stark, beautiful contrast to the heavy, oppressive shadows I was permanently leaving behind. I gently rubbed my jaw, a habitual physical gesture that no longer carried any residual nervous tension. The sweet fragrance of the small pine air freshener hanging securely from Eleanor's rearview mirror filled the small cabin. I touched the soft, textured fabric of my seatbelt. The physical restraint strangely emphasized the absolute liberation of my soul. I no longer possessed any dark secrets to violently protect. There were no hidden ledgers, no corrupt alliances, and absolutely no lingering threats lurking aggressively in the darkness. The devastating sorrow of my past had been entirely washed away by the incredibly powerful tide of justice. I listened closely to the steady, comforting sound of Eleanor's rhythmic breathing. The profound peace settling heavily over my resting body was the most magnificent reward I could ever gently imagine. The terrible, demanding hunt had concluded flawlessly. We merged effortlessly onto the busy main highway, heading enthusiastically toward the modern city and a perfectly blank, unwritten future. The past was totally dead, but a lingering question remained. Was I finally brave enough to experience peace? Emotion,